From the golden steppes of Eurasia to the wooded recesses of Germany, the sheer mountain passes of the Alps and the Pyrenees, and every village, town and city in between, there was not a theatre of the Napoleonic Wars where the thunder of hoofbeats could not be heard. Cavalry formed a mainstay in the armies of all belligerent nations, melding mobility, speed and range into a potent and versatile fighting force. Cavalry could reel and charge in decisive shock actions, pursue broken enemies, and screen against interdiction. Exceptional range came in useful for a variety of missions like foraging, scouting, escorting, and policing. Though cavalry were multi-purpose tools and could complete any one of several combat and non-combat missions readily enough, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, cavalry were classified into 3 distinct types, and then specializations within those types. So before we dive into the cavalry arm of La Grande Armée, we first need to have a look at the cavalry specializations in general terms. During the Napoleonic era, there existed 3 distinct types of cavalry, all building on archetypes from earlier periods: heavy cavalry, medium cavalry, and light cavalry. Heavy cavalry were heavily armed and armoured, mounted on thoroughbred warhorses. They had their origins in the armoured chevalier of medieval vintage, and continued that tradition as an on-call shock force. In battle, they reeled, charged, withdrew, and reformed, then to repeat the process until an enemy was broken. Though heavy cavalry could, and often did, perform the plethora of non-combat cavalry missions, mostly scouting and screening, these roles were to be performed principally by the light cavalry. Light cavalry had integrated into European armies over the last few centuries, as auxiliaries or mercenaries whose tactics and organizations were gradually formalized. During the Napoleonic Wars, light cavalry were relied upon to be the eyes and ears of an army. They also protected and policed the rear lines, raided into enemy territory, and pursued fleeing enemies. Though all light cavalry were, by necessity, generalists, varied mission sets encouraged specialization. Medium cavalry were a different beast entirely, and there's a reason I've left them to last. It would be wrong to say that medium cavalry were a liminal in-between a force, neither heavy nor light cavalry, but a combination of both. Medium cavalry were a fully fledged category in their own right, but one that was still evolving. Unlike light and heavy cavalry, which had centuries-long traditions on the European battlefield, medium cavalry were a relatively recent addition from the 17th century that originated as mobile infantry, basically a regular infantry force put on horseback. Situationally, this could be beneficial, but in the main negated both the advantages of the infantry's staying power and the mobility of the cavalry. By the 18th century, European armies kept their medium cavalry mounted, but didn't have an obvious place for them otherwise. In war, medium cavalry might be seen as an affordable alternative to true heavy cavalry, or a more robust light cavalry force. For our purposes, it's enough to say that medium cavalry doctrine is still being written during the Napoleonic Wars. With all that preamble out of the way, we can dig into the topic at hand, the cavalry forces of La Grande Armée. Under the Royal Army, France had several long-established heavy, medium, and light cavalry regiments. They were generally well regarded, especially the light cavalry, which had seen a great deal of development as lessons of the 7 Years' War were implemented. Amidst the tumult of revolution, France's cavalry forces were savaged by desertion and emigration. This military crisis, on top of the hundreds of others, seemed to spell the death knell for France's renowned cavalry. Despite dark skies ahead, these clouds had silver linings. The degradation of France's cavalry force created the space for reconstitution. This project fell to successive revolutionary governments. Heavy cavalry were expensive, few in number, and politically suspect, and so were sidelined. Light and medium cavalry, on the other hand, proved to be economical, effective, and patriotically motivated. Unlike with the infantry, where the old Royal Army was amalgamated into the new Revolutionary Army, the cavalry never underwent such a process of amalgamation. Extant units were kept on, while newly founded cavalry were composed entirely of volunteers. Eager though they were, the volunteers had little experience, and even less respect for the clear distinctions between light, medium, and heavy cavalry. Hybrid cavalry demi-brigade, often integrated into infantry battalions or companies, were the norm. Organisationally, this caused no small headache for bureaucrats in Paris, even if it was an overall success. Wherever they fought, the French cavalry gained valuable experience, leading to a flowering of innovation in tactics and organisation from the new generation of talent who'd taken to the saddle. In 1798, a brief respite from the worst of the fighting allowed the Directory government to re-establish a more conventional cavalry force. The nucleus remained the light and medium demi-brigades, to which were added reformed heavy cavalry. A demi-brigade of light cavalry contained 400 horsemen, a sabre or sabre in cavalry parlance. Each demi-brigade consisted of 4 escadrons, squadrons of 100 sabre each. 2 squadrons would be grouped together as a compagnie, company, mostly for administrative purposes. On paper, strength rarely matched reality. A demi-brigade would be fortunate to scrape together enough cavalrymen and their mounts to flesh out more than one company, leading to 2 understrength ones. This led to an awkward situation where understrength demi-brigades were officialized. Light cavalry demi-brigades could hit the 400 mark consistently, but medium and heavy cavalry struggled. Their numbers were reduced to 200 and 100 sabre, respectively, hardly worth calling a brigade. Tactically, these reduced formations were unable to operate independently anyway, leading to their being folded back into the infantry demi-brigades or seconded to a light cavalry demi-brigade, largely defeating the purpose of the reforms in the first place. Unsurprisingly, the Directory largely failed to reform the cavalry, and all pretense was lost when the War of the Second Coalition broke out. Only when the war ended in 1801 could this process be resumed, this time under the auspices of First Consul Napoleon. From 1802 onwards, as with the infantry, the cavalry would be reformed into Remounts de cavalerie, cavalry regiments. Each regiment would be one of a common type, so a light, medium or heavy cavalry regiment. Each contained 4 squadrons with 2 companies per squadron. The size of the company varied with the type of regiment. Light cavalry companies contained 140 sabre and 4 officers. Medium cavalry companies, 116 sabre and 3 officers. And heavy cavalry companies, 86 sabre and 3 officers. Regiments also had 3 support companies of around 8 men each, led by an officer, a company of mounted engineers, a medical company, and a maintenance company. Including the support companies, the approximate paper strength for each regiment was 580 men and 16 officers for a light cavalry regiment, 484 men and 12 officers for a medium cavalry regiment, and 346 men and 12 officers for a heavy cavalry regiment. With the exception of the Carabiniers and the Cuirassiers, the first company of all cavalry regiments was considered the Compagnie d'Élite, the elite company. This meant they had the right to don distinct uniforms, replete with the first shako. The elite company represented the regiment on parade, at inspections, and would advance in the place of honour at the right flank or head of a column. Additionally, the elite company escorted the regiment's officers, or as needed was detached to escort divisional or corps level headquarters. This organisation of the cavalry regiments was standard from 1804. In line with the general expansion of La Grande Armée in the build-up for the war against Prussia in 1806, each regiment was afforded an extra depot squadron. It remained in the reserve, training recruits and providing casualty replacements for the 4 frontline squadrons. In March 1807, Napoleon ordered most of these depot squadrons to be stood up as regular squadrons. Experience proved that more scouting and foraging was needed, so the light and medium regiments were expanded to between 6 and 7 squadrons. Some of the best light cavalry regiments were reinforced to 8 frontline squadrons. The heavy cavalry, meanwhile, lost their depot squadron and returned to the 1804 standard. In Napoleon's conception of warfare, cavalry were considered the main offensive force. It was vital that they be deployed only when the power of their shock action would have maximum impact. So rather than dispersing his cavalry among the various corps d'armée, Napoleon instead massed his cavalry in their own separate corps de réserve, the Reserve Corps, or the Cavalry Reserve. The Cavalry Reserve was formed alongside the corps d'armée in 1804 and commanded by Joachim Murat. Like all the corps, the cavalry were earmarked for the invasion of Britain, but redirected across the Rhine into Germany for the Ulm campaign after Austria's invasion of Bavaria in 1805. The light cavalry regiments ranged out on long-distance reconnaissance and raiding patrols, backed up by the medium cavalry. Heavy cavalry also performed scouting duties, but were generally withheld for use in major engagements. In effect, cavalry screened the infantry corps on a theatre level, the light and medium cavalry forming the forward edge, and the heavy cavalry as an offensive reserve. This pattern was repeated in the Austerlitz campaign, in 1806 during the Thuringia campaign and the defeat of Prussia, and in 1807 with the liberation of Poland and operations against the Russian Empire. The flexibility and effectiveness of the Cavalry Reserve system had been proven, though it was far from perfect. The proportion of light cavalry was determined to be far too low for reconnaissance and screening requirements, hence why the medium and heavy cavalry were pressed into those roles. Additionally, the decision to withhold the heavy cavalry as a striking force left some of Murat's best units in the rear for all but the heaviest engagements, making it hard to justify their much greater expense as compared to the light and medium cavalry regiments. After the 1807 Polish campaign, Napoleon had the breathing room to grapple with a revision to his cavalry corps. New light and medium regiments were raised, the sizes of those regiments increased, and in general, greater resources allocated to the training and provisioning of all cavalry forces. Though this did succeed in essentially doubling the size of the cavalry force from 36,000 strong to 77,000 strong, this came at the cost of massively denuding the quality of that force. Most new units were formed from cadres of existing units, depriving them of experienced officers who now had to lead a cavalry force consisting of 3/4 conscripts. The invasion of Iberia in February 1808 was the next big test. Until Napoleon personally intervened in Spain in September of that year, cavalry were deployed more typically as mixed divisions or brigades attached to corps. Unlike the artillery and infantry, the cavalry found campaigning in Spain and Portugal arduous. Grand-scale sweeping maneuvers were gone. The Iberian campaign was much more positional, a war of minor skirmishes and the occasional major battle that tested man and mount to the limits of endurance. Murat himself led the invasion of Iberia, and as per doctrine maintained a sizable cavalry reserve. However, it could not be used as the shock force envisioned, instead being needed to simply maintain the tenuous connections between strung-out corps. The Cavalry Reserve returned in earnest when Napoleon intervened personally. In the second wave of reinforcements to Spain, he had at his disposal 6 cavalry divisions. The Cavalry Corps was again reformed for the 1809 campaign against Austria. Until the invasion of Russia in 1812, much of the Cavalry Reserve was dispersed throughout Germany or deployed to Spain. The black hole that was the Iberian ulcer chewed up much of the light and medium cavalry force. Both on Napoleon's order and the initiative of corps commanders, several new regiments were raised explicitly for Spanish service, either by taking cadres of existing regiments and forming new ones, or combining provisional regiments into new units. The result was, by 1811, a numerically reduced cavalry force employed to Spain, but one that was far better suited to its type of campaigning, with a very high proportion of light and medium regiments. For the 1812 campaign, Napoleon again dug very deep to reforge the Cavalry Reserve. Since so many of his light and medium cavalry regiments were employed in Spain, he relied heavily on those of client states and allies. Dutch, German, Italian, and especially Polish cavalry would serve with distinction. The heavy cavalry remained almost entirely French and saw extensive employment. Proportions for all cavalry branches had changed drastically with the need to furnish more light regiments. In 1805, Napoleon had 14 heavy, 30 medium, and 39 light regiments. In 1812, he had 16 heavy, 24 medium, and 51 light regiments. The 25% increase in the size of the light cavalry came at the expense of the Dragoons, which, as we'll get to, were cannibalized to make lancer regiments. In the open expanses of Eastern Europe, Napoleon's cavalry returned to the large-scale maneuvers to which they were so well suited. From the Niemen to Moscow, they surged ahead like a torrent. La Grande Armée's cavalry arm was decimated by the retreat, as reserve mounts of war horses had to be apportioned to depleted supply and transport companies. Massive losses in battle diminished strength even further. Once fodder ran out, horses were slaughtered for food. Combat and scouting operations ceased, as all efforts went to forage for food and fodder to feed the starving army. None of the cavalry regiments that ranged into Russia in 1812 returned intact. Most were reduced in size to a few understrength companies. Few but the luckiest or toughest horsemen returned. Veterans of 1805 numbered only a few thousand. Those few survivors who might otherwise have counted themselves fortunate had left the frying pan for the fire. The 1813 campaign, in which Napoleon conducted a fighting retreat as his empire collapsed, saw the Grande Armée's cavalry suffer their gravest hardships. Either through defection or the destruction of their home nations, the foreign cavalry regiments largely disintegrated. In rearguard fighting against capable foes, casualties were heavy, with the training grounds in France unable to provide enough qualified replacements, namely of officers. Provisional regiments or regiments reformed from cadres were hastily mobilized, only to face coalition cavalry vetted and well organized. Nonetheless, highly effective French cavalry units remained in service, including die-hard Polish and Dutch regiments, but remounts were in such short supply that most of the cavalry remained in depot or in garrison. Indeed, so dire was the situation of the army that remounts were prioritized for the transport and supply companies over the cavalry. The situation was much the same in 1814, a year of, quote, bitter little triumphs, as historian John Elting describes. The rump French cavalry force fought on, a shadow of its former self, but still flashing with the occasional glimmer of past exploits. When their guard was down, coalition armies received painful reminders of the days when the French cavalry once turned the tide of battle. The final reprise of the French cavalry came in 1815 during the Waterloo campaign. Returned to a nominal strength of 20,000, the cavalry force was formidable and quite possibly might have proved decisive, if handled better, especially in the decisive Battle of Waterloo. Ney's famous, or rather infamous, charge against orders saw the cream of Napoleon's once proud cavalry crumble against disciplined Dutch, German, and British infantry squares. With a bit of context put aside, let's look at the specific cavalry arms, starting with the light cavalry. In French, la cavalerie légère. There were three arms of the light cavalry in French service: the Hussars, Lanciers, and Chasseur à cheval. Possibly the most famous of the Napoleonic Wars were the Hussars. Hussars had been a staple in French armies for a century. Hungarian, Croat, Serb, Czech, and Polish exiles in France were employed in cavalry units for service in the War of the Spanish Succession. They proved highly adept at the tactics of little war, raiding, scouting, and harassment honed over centuries on Balkan and Eastern European battlefields. In 1720, the first official Hussar regiment was formed under Hungarian-born General Ladislas Bercheny. So followed for the 2e Régiment Chamberin and the 3e Régiment Esterházy, formed in 1735 and 1764, respectively. Recruits were principally drawn from France, but the tradition of raising Hussar regiments on a foreign recruited corps remained strong. In 1776, the Hussars de Saxe, the Saxon Hussars, were formed from a cadre of Germans in French service. Over the next few decades, Hussar recruits were drawn principally from France's German-facing departments, in Alsace, Moselle, and Lorraine. The 5e Régiment Lausanne, Michel Ney's alma mater, barely considered themselves French at all. Indeed, the Alsatian character was so prevalent that commands were given in German and local fashions incorporated into the uniform. In 1791, as part of the National Assembly's delocalization drive, the extant regiments were reordered by number, not by region, stripping much of this parochial flair. For the fiercely independent Hussar regiments, it was too much, leading to a diaspora of officers and troopers. Only committed revolutionaries or die-hard horsemen remained in the saddle to reform their regiments. The slack was taken up by volunteer companies of light cavalry, fulfilling the roles of either chasseurs à cheval or hussars interchangeably. Their titles give an insight into the character of these units, based not on regional or royalist allegiance, but revolutionary fervour. For a few striking examples, we have the Hussards Noirs, the Black Hussars, the Hussards de la Mort, the Hussars of Death, the Hussards de la Montagne, the Hussars of the Mountain, in context meaning something more like Hussars of the left wing, and most tongue-tyingly of all, the Hussards défenseurs de la liberté et de l'égalité, the Hussar defenders of liberty and equality. The National Assembly recognised these units and formalised the most effective into 7 demi-brigades in 1793. Joined by the original 5, the reforged Hussars proved remarkably effective. Famed for their daring and bravado, the Hussars earned a reputation for fearlessness, veering often enough into recklessness. Napoleon would raise no new Hussar regiments until 1813, seeing good service from the 12 he inherited. Organisationally, they were only lightly modified and enlarged. Napoleon could have foisted great changes upon his Hussar regiments, but preferred instead to invest in the Chasseur à Cheval. For reasons of versatility and affordability, his preferred light cavalry option. Even had Napoleon tried to make great changes, the Hussars would have resisted fiercely. Given their diverse origins, each Hussar regiment boasted a unique uniform of a bewildering variety of styles, colours, textures, and adornments. I'll give a general overview of the style. Atop the head was worn a conical shako, originating from the first Hussar regiments in French service. By the time of the Revolutionary Wars, Hussar shakos were differentiated from their humdrum infantry counterparts by ornate adornments and a tall, red, black or white plume that was at least as tall as the already vertiginous shako. Imperial pattern shakos, first from the regulation of 1804, saw brass or silver front pieces attached, sometimes backgrounded by a coloured band. Each was stamped with the number of the regiment and an imperial eagle. Officers, sabeurs of the elite companies, and, depending on the unit, members of the regimental musique, wore a variant of the shako encased in fur. The fur was dark, black or brown, save for the 4e Régiment, which sourced white furs. The petite tenue of all cavalrymen was pretty much the same as in other branches of service. A body-length, white or grey overall worn with pantalon à cheval and a sleeveless waistcoat. Completing the look was a small beret-like cap called a bonnet de police. The petite tenue would be worn when undergoing training as a recruit, when off duty, or when the regular uniform was being washed or mended. But no self-respecting hussar lingered long in drabby downs when his Grande tenue was elegant enough to jolt the heartbeat of brave soldiers and lady admirers alike. Worn was a short coat with a tall collar, tightened down by 9 buttons, all coloured and patterned in the regimental style. Owing to its Hungarian origins, the coat was called a kinsky in France, but more commonly known as a dolman. Hussars enjoyed the widest range of colours, not bound by a common base tone as with all other cavalry branches. Breeches were generally blue or red, but the coats could be brown, light blue, white, green, red or grey. Red was the preferred tone for highlighting and facing, complemented by silver or gold cording and piping. Loose Hungarian-style breeches would be worn, failing that pantalon. Unbroken gold, red or silver lace piping stretched from the hip down to the ankle. Hussars didn't wear gaiters. Either they wore their knee-high leather boots over their pantalon, or bloused their pantalon over the boot. Popular too were pantalons à la salle, roomy, loose-fitting, with leather cuffs and straps to keep the kit sitting tight. Hussar boots were topped by more adornment around the boot lip. Leather gloves were worn, usually white or black. Completing the look was a striped waistcloth matching the regimental colours and cording in gold or silver. A side-slung cape called a pelisse was a little more functional, protection against sabre slashes and weather, made usually of fur, or at least lined with it. Again, officers, musicians or elite troops might wear additional adornments, like sashes, extra lacework, cockades, pom-poms, or emblazoned epaulettes. The cost of outfitting a Hussar regiment in full uniform was, given all of this, insane. Much more than a comparable Chasseur or Lancer regiment. To take some highlights from the 1813 materials list for the 2e Hussars, the regiment required 34 metres of scarlet wool cloth, 105 metres of green wool cloth, 326 metres of blue wool cloth, 360 metres of white flannel to line their pelisse, 252 metres of Moroccan red leather, 142 metres of cording, over 8 kilometres of braiding and lacing, and several thousand small and medium-sized buttons. Ever the dramatists, Hussars even turned grooming to expressive purpose. In general, French soldiers of all arms were encouraged to cut their hair short. A few regiments and the Imperial Guard were afforded the dignity of beards or moustaches. The Hussars flouted the rules by wearing their hair long, as was typical in the Royal Army. Braids of hair were then curled into lovelocks, called cadenettes. Lead weights, jewels and coins were threaded into the bottom of these locks to keep them weighed down, creating a kind of buoyant, jingling effect when they rode. After 1808, Napoleon started to clamp down on atypical grooming standards of the Hussars, but the cadenet were going out of style anyway. The mighty moustache lived on though, and in the Hussars we are graced by some of the most exquisite entrances into the Moustache Hall of Fame. Follicularly challenged fresh-faced recruits had trouble growing the requisite hair, so substituted horsehair, or in a pinch, boot polish. For all the flash and panache exuded by the Hussar uniform, they were well aware that their business was war. Cavalry equipment was standard, the stirrups, saddle, satchel and so on, so we'll focus on what was unique to the Hussar. As part of the 1804 regulations, all cavalry regiments were to be furnished with satchels that draped over the horse for clear identification. Where the Chasseur à Cheval were content to leave their satchels blank, save for the regimental number, the Hussars got creative. The 1er and 7e Hussars ensconced their regimental number in a golden laurel wreath, the 7e also adding crossed battle axes. The 3e, 6e, 8e and 10e proudly bore the imperial eagle, perched atop the number. Colour returned as the satchels were wrapped in red, blue and white leather. The black satchel of the 11e Hussars looked comparatively Spartan, until you remember the 11e were still Hussars, and their number was big and gold. The standard weapon of the Hussars was a curved sabre. Officers wore a more ornate version of the standard sabre. Junior officers might source a slightly more upmarket sabre with fur scabbard or sculpted handguard. Wealthier officers could afford fine adornments like pearlescent scabbards, braided knots and polished inlays. Long-serving officers might also have been able to procure an authentic Mameluke sabre. When the blade was reset in a French-made grip and hilt, they made the finest weapon a hussar could possess. At rest, a sabre would not be worn close to the hip like an infantryman, but loose, suspended down closer to the knee. This was to keep the sabre in easy reach when the hussar was mounted, as a normal, close-in scabbard would constrict movement. When fighting, a hussar would tether the sabre with a lanyard, either attached to their belt or a loop in the coat arm. In this way, a dropped weapon would come back to the rider. The sabre was not merely an effective weapon, it was a badge of office that distinguished them from the chasseur à cheval. Because though the hussars did carry pistols, even carbines, undeniably useful for skirmishing work, they weren't meant to. The blurred doctrinal edges highlighted the definite professional rivalry hussars held with their chasseur à cheval colleagues. In part, this was a culture clash, the quiet competence of the chasseur à cheval, the ostentatious exalt of the hussars. Doctrinally, their tactics and operations were not too different from those of the chasseur à cheval, who could do those jobs just as well, if not better, and didn't cost an arm and a leg. This is all to say hussars had to work hard to justify their existence. It's telling that while Napoleon founded 5 chasseur à cheval regiments, for a grand total of 31, he would only found 3 more hussar regiments only very late in the Napoleonic Wars. In 1812, he founded the 12e Hussars from a cadre of the 9e. In 1813, he founded the 13e Régiment d'Hussards of Jérôme Napoleon and the 14e Régiment d'Hussards Turin. Earlier, the 10e and 11e Hussars were only incorporated into service after the annexation of Holland. Conscious of their precarious position, the Hussars differentiated themselves as a battle force rather than the all-rounder chasseur à cheval. In battle, hussars were the most aggressive, energetic and ambitious of French cavalry. Chasseur à cheval could screen effectively with carbines, but hussars had to get stuck in with sabres to be effective. They became the bane of exposed skirmishers or isolated artillery, slicing and careening through gaps in the enemy line. In a stand-up fight against other cavalry, the hussars relied upon their mobility to pull away, regroup and re-engage. However, when their timing was good, hussars were more than capable of routing heavier cavalry, as happened when the 12e Hussars routed a division of Spanish lancers and dragoons at Medellin in 1809. Hussars also tended to take the lead in pursuits, and were particularly exacting in the routes of the Austrian army in 1805, the Prussian army in 1806, and the Russian army in 1807. Against more serious rearguards, especially ones composed of light cavalry, they tended to struggle. In his memoirs, Louis-Gabriel Suchet recalled an action where a Capitaine Charron of the 4e Hussars pursued too vigorously a fleeing rearguard of Spanish lancers. They captured 52 Spaniards and their flag, but not before Charron was speared through. All the Hussar regiments had long and distinguished careers in service. The 1er Hussars claimed 40 flags, 303 cannons, and 26,300 enemies in over 1,200 engagements and skirmishes from 1792 to 1802. Their official record by 1815 acknowledged fully 44 pitched battles, with honours for Jemappes, Castiglione, Eylau, and Oporto. The 2e Hussars, who never lost their self-regard as Les Chamberons, boasted 46 pitched battles, singled out with honours at Hondschoote, Austerlitz, Friedland, and Medellin. Plenty of France's premier cavalry leaders, like Michel Ney, got their start in the Hussars. Born to the saddle, Emmanuel Grouchy was a one-time colonel of the 6e Hussars in 1792, a général de division by June 1795, and going on to serve with distinction in Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, famously ending up in command of the Cavalry Reserve in 1815. Christophe Antoine Merlin spent 12 years as a colonel of the 6e Hussars and later 1er Hussars, making Général de Brigade in February 1805. He did great credit to the Hussars in several actions of the Spanish campaign and in the 100 Days. To this list we'll add several other Hussar leaders who have cropped up in our story so far. Antoine Rigaud of the 10e Hussars, Jean-François Dupre of the 2e Hussars, Claude-Étienne Guyot of the 9e Hussars, and Pierre-Claude Pajol of the 6e Hussars. Baden-born François-Xavier Nicolas Schwartz was a natural horseman, and a dashing hussar to boot. He served first as a volunteer of the 2e Hussars, promoted to colonel of the 5e Hussars in 1799, just in time to command the regiment in Germany and Italy. He was a général de brigade in 1806, after which he commanded several hodgepodge cavalry regiments in Spain, until captured in 1810. Charles Edward Jennings Quillermain, an Irish-born officer in French service, joined first as a volunteer. Renowned for his superb performance as colonel of the 6e Hussars, he was promoted to general, but struggled outside of regimental command. Quillermain was a notorious looter, and rarely fought when the odds were not in his favour. Fighting as a divisional commander in Napoleon's first Italian campaign, he won the soon-to-be consul's respect, though not his approval, only to die of sickness in 1799. Indeed, death was an ever-present fact of life for Hussar officers, who faced very high proportions of officer casualties. Indicative is the experience from 1792 to 1815 of the 1er Hussars, which had 57 officers wounded in action and 12 killed in action. The 5e Hussars bore the brunt, 96 wounded and 16 killed, with 12 wounded and 2 killed in one day alone during the Battle of Mir in July 1812. Rather than shy away from the danger of their profession, Hussars positively revelled in it. Summing up this attitude is a quote attributed to Antoine Lassalle, France's Hussar savant. Quote, "Any Hussar who is not dead by 30 is a coward." Though possibly apocryphal, the quote conveys the death-defying bravado of the Hussars. On the battlefield, they were expected to build the legend of their regiment with spectacular acts of courage and gallantry. In another episode from the Spanish campaign, Suchet recalled an attempted ambush by 500 Spanish Dragoons and as many infantry on a bivouacked squadron of the 4e Hussars at Uldasona. With maybe a dozen sabre at his back, Lieutenant Delamare charged the Spanish. Delamare's reckless, almost certainly fatal charge invade the rest of the squadron to follow suit, later joined by 80 French Cuirassiers alerted by the commotion. 50 Spanish Dragoons lay dead before Delamare's band was, incredibly, rescued, alive and well. Not done, Delamare rallied his squadron for a pursuit of the fleeing Spanish infantry. It seems the 4e Hussars were known for this sort of thing. Suchet also singled out a Lieutenant Paté, quote, "a fearless soldier who had already lost an eye in the war." Challenged to a duel by a Spanish Hussar officer, Paté obliged. Horses circling, sun blaring, In the clash of sabres, the French officer cut down his opponent before leading a charge at the enemy. Off the field, Hussars furthered their reputation, courting, wooing, and often enough eloping with beautiful women. Once their horses were watered and fed, the Hussars fell upon any damsel, maiden, or madam to be found, to the dismay of husbands, fathers, brothers, and often as not, fellow officers. Any self-respecting Hussar would try his luck in a parlour, salon, or coffee house with a woman of class and sophistication, hoping their renegade reputation, battlefield exploits, and stylish uniforms enough to thaw even the most frigid heart. The tradition of sleeping with a girl from every one of Napoleon's domains all started with the Hussars. Commissioning of a young officer was incomplete until he was given 5 girls and 5 bottles of champagne, and told not to return until all the champagne was drunk and all the girls breathless. It seems Hussars needed an outlet for an abundance of energy, which displayed as aggression in combat, excess in everything else. Perhaps no other Hussar officer quite so completely embodied the Hussar spirit of death before dishonour than François Fournier. Known unaffectionately as Le Diable, Fournier was an infamous rake. In terms of his military career, Fournier was a confident and brave leader, but prone to dereliction. He started out in the Dragoons in 1792, rose through the ranks, eventually making commander of the Guards of Augereau's Quartier Général. At various points, Fournier was cashiered or singled out for malingering and negligence, but such was the need for officers, especially brave ones, that none of these charges stuck. Subsequently, Fournier commanded a Hussar brigade in Italy. Bumpy years followed in which he deliberately or otherwise found himself in reserve assignments. It was here he developed a taste for dueling. Fournier's MO was to insult the wives of anybody who displeased him. For a while he was happy to kill or maim town councillors and officials, but soon graduated to fellow officers. Nothing could be done officially as Fournier was sure to act within the confines of the dueling code, always called out and thus technically not the instigator. Like all army officers, Napoleon was aware of Fournier and kept a wide berth. When consul, he crafted regulations against dueling specifically to stop Fournier, whom he justifiably called a cannibal. Fournier's streak of terror could not last forever. His foil was a young Pierre Dupont, who would go on to command a division and later corps. They'd first crossed swords in 1794 and would clash over the next 2 decades in dozens of duels. Evidently, Dupont was the superior shot and swordsman, eventually forcing a truce. Eventually, Fournier's misdeeds caught up with him. After a lackluster performance at Leipzig and some choice remarks for Napoleon, he was relieved and arrested. So the story goes, on the way to prison, the coach was waylaid by Cossacks. Sword in hand, Fournier fought side by side with his captors. Where dishonour trails in the wake of Fournier, the beau sabreur, Antoine Lassalle, was every inch a brave, dashing, irresistible hussar. Born in Metz to a minor family of the noblesse d'épée, the young Lassalle joined an infantry regiment as a junior officer in 1786. But his passion was for the cavalry, and he transferred to the Grosse Cavalerie in 1791. Decommissioned in 1792, were it not for war with Austria and Prussia, his career might have been over before it really started. A fiery revolutionary, he joined the 23e demi-brigade of the Chasseur à Cheval, honing innate talents as a maréchal des logis. Making his leadership debut, Lassalle spied a battery of underdefended Austrian cannon. Rallying a company of the Chasseur, he charged down and captured the battery, as well as the eye of General François Kellerman. Lassalle was soon a member of his staff. Serving under Napoleon in Italy as a chef d'escadron, Lassalle again put in a stellar performance, routing and capturing Austrian units at Vicenza, Rivoli, and Piave. The Rivoli performance was particularly daring. Throughout the battle, Lassalle followed Napoleon's orders, charging again and again with a diminishing band of dragoons, receiving 4 wounds in the doing. When the Austrians finally broke and fled, Lassalle was at the head of the pursuing cavalry. The deed did not go unnoticed. Presented the captured flags, Napoleon joked to Lassalle, quote, "Lie down, you've earned it." Thereafter, Lassalle was a Napoleonic favourite, and accompanied Napoleon to Egypt, where he was promoted to Général de Brigade. There he served until 1799, personally saving Davout's life from a Mameluke rider at the Battle of Ramadier, slicing the assailant's hands clean off with a sabre strike. From 1804 until 1808, LaSalle served as a commander of several cavalry regiments, fighting in the 1805, 1806 and 1807 campaigns. Perhaps his finest moment came in October 1806, when he induced Stettin Fortress to surrender to barely 500 Hussars of the 5e and 7e regiments. In the words of historian Charles Mullier, quote, "This feat of arms of unprecedented audacity brought into our power a fortress in good condition, well supplied, armed with 160 cannon, and occupied by 6,000 men." Napoleon was well pleased, promoting LaSalle Général de Division and giving him command of the light cavalry of the Cavalry Reserve. During the 1807 campaign, LaSalle was detached with the light division and served on several detached assignments, screening and foraging for the main army. At the Battle of Heilsberg, his handling of his division was exemplary. Murat was at one point assailed by 12 Russian dragoons. LaSalle rushed in, sabred an enemy officer, and attacked the rest. But LaSalle in turn was then surrounded, only to be rescued by Murat. Shaking hands, Murat exclaimed, quote, "Mon général, nous sommes quittes," best translated as, "now we're even." In 1808, LaSalle was again commanding a light cavalry division, this time in Spain, where he served well under Marshal Bessières. In the pacification of Asturias alone, LaSalle routed a 7,000-strong Spanish force at Torquemada, inflicting 1,000 casualties. At Medina de Rio Seco, LaSalle's sweeping charge round the flank of Blake's entrenched army secured a stunning victory. Having served in every one of Napoleon's campaigns since 1796, LaSalle was a no-brainer for the looming war with Austria, fighting at Aspen-Essling and Rabe. According to Savary, LaSalle had a presentiment on the eve of the Battle of Wagram that it would be his last. He was right. Wounded first by a bullet to the chest pursuing the retiring Austrians, LaSalle was killed by a shot to the head. He was 34, a little older than 30, and certainly no coward. LaSalle combined cunning and daring with lethal ability, a trifecta of talent that saw him sorely missed by his peers. Napoleon had lavished upon him rewards in his lifetime, making him a chevalier and later imperial count. Upon his death, a statue was erected in his image on the Place de la Concorde, and a street in Metz named in his honour. Beyond his martial exploits, LaSalle's prowess as a ladies' man and rabble-rouser was legendary. By 1803 he'd settled down some, marrying and forming a family, but LaSalle was still an incorrigible hussar, and his wife was formerly the wife of a fellow officer, whom LaSalle had cuckolded. Chasseurs à cheval were the youngest branch of the French cavalry arm. They had their origins in Cavalry Légion that had fought for the Kingdom of France in the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War. 6 regular regiments were formed in 1779, and another 6 in 1788. These 12 original Chasseurs à cheval regiments were decimated by revolutionary diaspora, and thus the National Assembly returned in 1791 to the exigency of volunteers. From 1792 to 1795, 13 of these regular units were gradually regularized as Chasseurs à cheval demi-brigades. 2 of these units would be disbanded in 1794, but this still left Napoleon, by the time he was consul, fully 24 Chasseurs à cheval demi-brigades, reorganized in 1802 as Chasseurs à cheval regiments. That same year, he would incorporate the 26e Régiment de Chasseurs à cheval, formed from a Piedmontese hussar regiment. The 27e Régiment de Chasseurs à cheval d'Arambert was founded in 1808, converted from a Franco-Belgian Lancer Legion led by Prosper Louis d'Arambert. The 28e Régiment de Chasseurs à cheval Toscane was formed on the same lines as a conversion of a Tuscan dragoon regiment. The 29e, 30e and 31e regiments were formed in 1810 as amalgamations of provisional light cavalry regiments and then serving in Spain or depots in France. Napoleon loved his Chasseurs à cheval, the eyes and ears of the army. Unlike with the Hussars, there was little pomp with the Chasseurs, just solid soldiering. He relied upon them heavily for scouting and reconnaissance into enemy territory, as well as for foraging and raiding. As the name suggests, chasseurs à cheval, translated literally as hunters at horse or more symbolically, mounted hunters, were horse-borne skirmishers. Their primary weapon was the mousqueton, the cavalry carbine variant of the Charleville musket. So armed, they skirmished with infantry and cavalry, harassed enemy formations, screened friendly flanks, and fought, albeit seldom, in dismounted light infantry actions. The preference for the mousqueton led the chasseurs à cheval to be brigaded with the Hussars into light cavalry divisions, where the combined arms of close and long-range weapons provided a highly effective pairing. Still, the chasseurs à cheval would get up close and personal as needed. For pursuits and for charges, the chasseurs à cheval carried at their hip the standard sabre, though the 12e chasseurs à cheval preferred the longer, straight-edged dragoon swords. Uniforms for the chasseurs à cheval lent more towards function over form, but kept the light cavalry's slender, neat look. The petite tenue was a sleeveless, high-collared waistcoat worn over overalls and breeches. Recruits often wore a white, undyed version, whereas regimental variants bore the regimental colours. In all cases, the base colour was a rich, dark green, though the collars, cuffs and facings could vary widely from orange, pink, yellow, blue and red. The Grande tenue consisted of the same waistcoat and overalls worn with a kinsky adorned with lace pipework. Breeches were swapped for pantalons à cheval. Each regiment wore a black shako, stamped with a silver plate bearing the regimental number and an imperial eagle. Plumes and cockades also adorned the shako. Riding boots and spurs were worn over the pantalon. Officers and musicians wore epaulettes and more elaborate shakos. Overall, Chasseur wore an elegant, clean uniform. Certainly Napoleon liked it, wearing a derivation in the Garde's version as daily wear from 1804 to 1815. The uniform also reflected well the personality of the men who donned them. Chasseurs à cheval prized professionalism and vigilance. Hussars might command the fascinations of the public, called upon to do the undoable, but chasseurs were everyday all-rounders, worked hard and more often. For this reason alone, there was little pretense about them. They were not insecure about their place in the army and felt no need to project. Their esprit du corps manifested not as arrogance, more like a quiet pride. Napoleon dignified their restraint with awards and honours, but demanded much in return. Chasseurs à cheval were employed extensively as part of the Cavalry Reserve from 1804 to 1807. In Spain, right throughout the campaign, the chasseurs à cheval were indispensable. In 1809 and then 1812, Napoleon moved heaven and earth to have enough chasseurs à cheval regiments available, preferencing them above not only the hussar but even the heavy cavalry. In 1812, 1813 and 1814, the chasseurs à cheval were again at the fore, and later protecting the army in its hellish retreat west. Officer casualties for most regiments during their imperial service from 1805 to 1814 or 1815 depending on the unit falls within a band of about 40 to 70 killed and wounded. The 12e Regiment stands out with its 22 killed and 64 wounded, for a total of 86. For the 24 pre-imperial regiments, this is unsurprising, having served extensively and continuously from 1792 to 1815. To take the 12e Regiment again, they participated in 23 major battles, earning honours for Jemappes, Maastricht, Wagram and Krasno. The tactics employed by the chasseurs à cheval had been honed in the heady days of the Revolutionary Wars. This tradition, as something of a proving ground for cavalry talent, continued well into the Napoleonic Wars. Several of France's most renowned cavalry commanders, who would serve as generals leading divisions or brigades, and some even entire corps, got their start in command as colonel of chasseurs. To name a few, we have Louis Sahuc, Rémy Excelmont, Louis-Pierre Montbrun, Marie Letteur Mabord, Jacques Subervie, Anne-François Treillard, François-Marie Colbert, Louis Lepic, Bertrand Castex, Henri Stangel, Marcelin Marbeau, and Jacques Vial. Chasseurs à cheval regiments were also home to a few relations of other famous commanders or statesmen. Talleyrand's son, Edmond Alexandre Talleyrand, commanded the 8e Regiment in 1813. Paul-Ange Louis Gardan, younger brother of Claude Mathieu Gardan, led the 9e for 3 years until badly wounded in 1799, Pierre-Benoit Soult, commanded the 25e from 1802 to 1807. Bertrand Bessières, also a younger brother, served as a colonel of the 11e for 6 years and was wounded at Austerlitz. The young Alphonse Grouchy, born in 1789, followed his father's path into the cavalry, commanding 2 separate chasseurs à cheval in 1813 and 1814. Though a pinch of nepotism certainly helped the careers of these officers, each undoubtedly earned their spurs. One chasseur à cheval officer stands out above the rest, however. Jean-Pierre Bruyère was born in Sommiers in 1772. Headstrong and restless, he volunteered for action to protect the revolution in France, fighting in various infantry brigades until eventually making the rank of lieutenant in the staff of General Joubert. Talent spotted, he was transferred to the staff of Louis-Alexandre Berthier in 1797. As a reward for exceptional courage during the Battle of Marengo, during which Bruyère braved fire and Hungarian Hussars to deliver Napoleon's orders to Desailles, he was allowed to follow his heart to the 7e Hussars demi-brigade, then the 5e Hussars as chef d'escadron. Gaining some cavalry experience, Bruyère stayed in Italy in 1805 where he commanded the 23e Chasseurs à Cheval, being wounded in the thigh at Vicenza. Berthier again wanted him for his staff, and so Bruyère was present at Jena, excelling in his post. Clearly Berthier's nurturing paid off. Bruyère was promoted to Général de Brigade and served under La Salle in the Polish campaign. Leading his brigade, he routed 6,000 Russians at Eylau, but suffered a shot to the arm that deflected into his chest. At Wagram, Bruyère was hit twice more, one shot shattering his femur, the other his shoulder. Before he returned to France to recuperate, Napoleon singled Bruyère out for accolades, promoting him to Général de Division. From 1810 to 1811 he recovered, actually retiring from the army and starting a family. But Bruyère couldn't resist his calling, and when Napoleon went east, Bruyère was there. Leading a light cavalry division, Bruyère was at the leading edge of the advance, taking Vilnius and routing enemy armies. He went on to fight at Ostovno, Smolensk and Borodino. At Ostovno alone, his division captured 600 prisoners and 8 cannon. At Smolensk, they bested wave after wave of Cossacks and Uhlans as they wrestled for control of pivotal high ground. At Borodino, his flanking attacks inflicted great pain on the Russians. Having gone through Russia unscathed, it was in Germany where luck caught up to Bruyère. At the Battle of Reichenbach, a cannonball tore off both his legs. Lingering on for 2 weeks, he died in June 1813. Had he lived longer, Bruyère was in the running for a marshal's baton. Chasseurs à cheval officers like Bruyère exhibited the determination and collectedness of true professionals. Much of this stemmed from the need to be very diligent scouts. That meant more than merely seeing what was ahead. It meant mapping, topography and accurate assessments of points of interest, enemy strength, and negotiability of terrain. These skills came in handy during a pursuit, in which chasseurs à cheval were the undisputed masters. Pursuing Trant's Anglo-Portuguese column at Garde, Marmont unleashed his chasseurs à cheval. Quote, Marmont realized that his infantry could not catch them, but seeing their hurry and disorder ordered his cavalry, his own escort squadron and the 13th Chasseur, to pursue and charge the rear guard of the retreating column. They overtook it by the bridge of Faya, 3 miles outside of Garde, where the road to Cellarico descends on a steep slope to cross the river. The leading French squadron scattered the 40 Dragoons at the tail of Trant's division, and rode on, mixed with them, against the rear guard of the battalion. The militiamen, startled and caught utterly by surprise, tried to form across the road and to open the fire, but the rain had damped their cartridges and hardly a musket gave fire. Thereupon the battalion went to pieces, the men nearest the French throwing down their guns and asking for quarter, while those behind scattered uphill or downhill from the road, seeking safety on the steep slopes. The charge swept downhill onto the battalion of Aveiro, and other successive units of the Oporto Brigade, which broke up in confusion. 5 of their 6 colours were taken, and 1,500 prisoners were cut off, while some tumbled into the Mondego and were drowned. Notice how in this action the chasseurs à cheval fought smart, not hard, seizing on the opportunity afforded by wet powder and rain. Indeed, chasseurs were supremely confident troops, marked just as much by their restraint as by their daring. Marcelin Marbeau, a squadron leader of the 23e Chasseur à Cheval, and aide-de-camp to Napoleon and others, recorded his account of events for posterity. Of his regiment, Marbeau said this: "I can safely say that if I ever saw a regiment in as good a condition as the 23e Chasseur, I never saw better. It was not that it contained men of surpassing merit, such as I have occasionally known in other regiments, but if there was no man in the 23e of extraordinary ability, there was not one who was not thoroughly up to his duty. All were on the same level of courage and zeal. There was no weak spot. The officers, highly intelligent and sufficiently well trained, were of excellent character, and lived together as true brethren in arms. It was the same with the non-commissioned officers, and the troopers followed their good example. Nearly all were veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland and Wagram, and most had 3 or at least 2 good conduct stripes. Those who had only one were a small minority. They were a splendid lot of men from Normandy, Alsace, Lorraine and the Franche-Comté, provinces well known for their military spirit and love of horses. Their long stay in Germany had brought men and horses into perfect condition, and when I took command of the regiment, it had an effective strength of over 1,000 fighting men, well disciplined, calm, and able to hold their tongues, especially in the presence of the enemy." Leading the regiment into Russia, Marbeau recounts one night action near Vilnius in 1812. Quote, "Two of the bravest non-commissioned officers, Prudhomme and Graft, went with Lieutenant Bertin to watch the movements of the enemy. In a few moments they came back, announcing that a column of Russian cavalry was crossing the ford, that several squadrons were already on the bank. Immediately, I ordered an immense hayrick and several barns to be set on fire. The flames lighted up the whole country, and I could plainly see the enemy's column, consisting of the Grodno Hussars. I had with me 1,000 brave troopers. With cries of Vive l'Empereur, we galloped upon the Russians, who, surprised at so brisk and unexpected an attack, turned round and fled in disorder, sabred by the Chasseur, towards the ford over which they had come. There we found ourselves face to face with a Dragoon regiment, which, being brigaded with them, had followed them, and was only just coming out of the river. From the shock and confusion of the two regiments there resulted a fearful disorder, of which my men took advantage to kill a great number of the enemy and capture many horses. The Russians threw themselves into a headlong tumult into the ford in order to escape the shots which my chasseurs were firing from the bank. A good many were drowned. The dawning day lighted up our battlefield, where lay several hundred of the enemy killed or wounded. Well led and trained, they were a formidable force, worthy of the esteem in which Napoleon held them. Of the 3 branches of the French light cavalry, lanciers, properly in French the chevaux légers lanciers, or light horse lancers, had sparse history in French service. Where Eastern and Central European armies had integrated Ulan units into their cavalry forces, nothing comparable had ever taken up arms in France until Maurice de Saxe formed units from Poles and Saxons. These units were not regularized and so faded away, even if the use of the lance did not. During the Revolutionary Wars, Polish volunteers, joined by a grab bag of Eastern European defectors and inductees, formed their own lancer units. When Napoleon assumed the consulship, France had no official lancer demi-brigades on the books. What they did have was a few mostly Polish lancer companies incorporated into other light cavalry units. Really, the first taste Napoleon got of the potential of lancers was on the receiving end of their 12-foot-long weapons. Prussia, Austria and Russia all had long traditions of regular Ulan regiments, equipped and trained in the Polish method. The Duchy of Warsaw furnished Napoleon with his first full regiment of lancers, serving as a regiment in the Vistula Legion. This prototype run was very promising. Charging in with their long lancers, the lancers could inflict terrible damage against infantry and cavalry. The Poles had honed this system further, charging with lancers in the first rank, carbines and pistols in the second. Despite specializing as a shock force, the lancers were still light cavalry, capable of the full range of scouting and foraging duties. With the pressing need to rapidly expand the light cavalry arm in the preparation for the 1812 campaign, lancers were an obvious pick. The problem was where they'd come from. In June 1811, Napoleon resolved to convert 6 dragoon regiments into lancer regiments. This was not to be a tick-and-flick decree. Retraining and re-equipping the regiments would be a lengthy and expensive ordeal. To begin, the Dragoon regiments were already deployed to Spain, so a cadre was taken from each and bucked up by recruits. Training took place at depots in France, later Germany and Poland. Conversion progressed steadily enough, but not without problems. Most of the recruits were French and had no experience with the Lancers or Lancer tactics, neither did their instructors. A whole new methodology had to be developed for training and education, cribbing heavily from the Poles. It made sense to rely on the Poles as much as possible, and Napoleon formed 3 Polish Lancers to complement his 6 French Lancers. The Vistula Legion was reorganized as the 7e Régiment de Cheval légère Lanciers, and a cadre from the Lancers of the Imperial Guard formed the 8e Régiment. A nascent 30e Régiment of the Chasseur à Cheval, formed in Hamburg in February 1811, was converted into the 9e Régiment. Despite being referred to informally as the Polish regiments, recruits were drawn from all across the French Empire. The first batch of transfers were Poles directly from the Duchy of Warsaw's own regiments, but Hungarians, Lithuanians, Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, Ukrainians, and of course French would serve in their regiments. Given the slightly different origins of the French and Polish Lancers, they were dressed differently. French Lancers resembled Dragoons, with green uniforms differentiated by varying colours for the facing. Their helmets were made of brass and topped with a plume. The Polish Lancers were a little more colourful. The 7e and 8e Régiment kept the blue and yellow of the Vistula legions, the 9e green and gold. All 3 wore the traditional headwear of Polish-style Lancers, the szapka. A szapka, like a shako, was a tall conical hat but distinguished with a square top. The red and white of Poland were represented on a coloured plume. Apart from this, Lancer equipment was universal. The same basic petite tenue, pantalon, boots and crossbelt. Naturally, the Lancers were equipped with a lance, a 3-metre-long spear with a sharp steel tip. For identification, on the end of each lance draped a pennon of the squadron colour on the lower half, white on top. The cavalry sabre and bayonet were standard, though NCOs were issued hatchets too. Pistols were part of the official equipment list, but soon replaced by cavalry carbines. All that equipment came in handy for the wide range of duties Napoleon rushed his Lancers into. Their trial by fire came in 1812 with the invasion of Russia. Newly hatched, the Lancers might be expected to have withered against the seasoned spears of the Cossacks, but they more than held their own, the initial cadres of veteran officers paying dividends. The lance was proving its worth. The lance's most obvious benefit was its increased reach, well beyond the head of the horse. In general, it was acknowledged that man for man, the most devastating charge possible was delivered by a lancer simply through the brute penetrative force of the lance. Officers of the time theorized, and were proved correct, that the lance was best employed against infantry. Auguste Marmont wrote in a treatise on cavalry, quote, "The lance is the weapon of the cavalry of the line, and principally destined to combat infantry. The sabre cannot take its place. What use will cavalry make of sabres if the infantry remains firm and is not afraid? The horseman cannot sabre the foot soldier, because the bayonets keep the horse at too great a distance. On the whole, the advantage of the lance is in the struggle with the infantry." Combined with the effective pistol and carbine fire, and quick exploitation by sabre-wielding Hussars, Chasseur, Lancers could consistently outfight enemy infantry, including those in cavalry squares. During the Battle of Dresden, for example, 2 Austrian regiments, arrayed in squares, repulsed 2 cavalry attacks by Dragoons and Cuirassiers. Dug in on high ground and supported by cannon fire, they seemed immovable until half a squadron of the Lancers, at most 60 men, rode up under fire and simply poked holes in the Austrian squares. A few horsemen broke in, cats among the pigeons, and before long the enemy was broken. For similar reasons, the lance proved to be something of a hard counter to enemy cavalry, when Lancers employed bunched together in a tight formation. Lancers could keep enemy horsemen at a distance while firing into them with carbines. The Lancer's long reach also helped when fighting irregulars. Hiding in defiles, hedges or trees meant little if the lance could reach you. The same went for artillerymen hiding under guns. That all said, the lance did have its drawbacks. It took a great deal of skill to use a lance proficiently, and with only the cadres of Poles to rely on, all French recruits had to learn fast and learn hard. No spares were carried, and a lancer could easily snap his weapon or leave it embedded in an enemy if too forceful. The force of a strike could also be transmitted up the shaft, unhorsing an unwary rider. Recruits were taught to angle the tip, striking up and away from the enemy. By virtue of its length, the lance was also very cumbersome in close quarters fighting. British troopers in Spain reported being very intimidated by the lancers until they learned they could grapple with them, pulling the rider to the ground by latching onto his weapon. Marbot experienced this in Russia. Quote, "I was opposed to the Cossacks of the Garde. We moved forward at a gallop, and when we were at a suitable distance from the enemy, General Castex ordered the charge, and his whole brigade fell in one line against the Russians. By the violence of this attack, the 24th overwhelmed the Dragoons who opposed them, but my regiment experienced more resistance from the Cossacks, a chosen band of men superior in stature, each armed with a 14-foot lance which he knew well how to use. Some of my chasseurs were killed and many wounded, but once my gallant troopers had broken through this line bristling with steel, they had the advantage, for the long lancers are ineffective against cavalry when those carrying them are disorganized and closely engaged by adversaries who are armed with sabres which they can use with ease, while the lancers have great difficulty in presenting the point of their weapons. Thus the Cossacks were forced to turn their backs, whereupon my men slaughtered many of them and captured a large number of splendid horses. If truly pressed, lancers could abandon their weapons, resorting to the sabre. Once French lancers got a handle on their weapons, if they faced cavalry, they were known to deposit their lances and come back for them, even if this tactic was officially forbidden. Overall, it might be said that the lance was far more situational than the sabre, primarily an offensive weapon ill-suited to personal defence. In all theatres and conditions, the lancers won plaudits, executing some death-defying missions under courageous commanders like Paul Desmancourt, Jacques-Philippe Avis, and Martin Charles Gobrecht. The Polish lancer regiments had their fair share of excellent commanders too. Ignace Ferdinand Stokowski, Casimir Alexandre Tonsky, and Thomas Lubienski did their people proud. Pierre Berruyère, chef d'escadron of the 3e Dragoons, and after 1811 the 2e Lancers, was noted for his exceptional calm and bravery, earning him a promotion to Général de Brigade in 1814. He died at Ligny. The next day, at Waterloo, the 2e's new Lancer leader, Jean-Baptiste Soult, came away second best in a clash with some English cavalry, losing an arm. He was back in the saddle within the hour, just one of 17 of the regiment's officers badly wounded that day. Indeed, officer casualties in the Lancers were high. In their short careers, they racked up casualty lists as long as those of cavalry regiments that had served continuously since 1804. Among them were sons of senior officials and ministers. Laurent Marbeuf of the 6e Lancers died of wounds on the retreat through Russia. Alexandre Lebrun, son of François Lebrun, arch-treasurer of the Empire, served as a chef d'escadron of the 3e Lancers and died at the head of his squadron at the Battle of Pultusk. The exception was the charmed career of the 4e Lancers, who despite fighting in the thick of it in 1812, 1813, 1814 and 1815, suffered only 10 officer losses. Given the short window of time in which the Lancers existed, there weren't many great cavalry commanders uniquely associated with them, save for one. Louis-Pierre Montbron was born in Hérault in 1770. Commissioned a lieutenant of the premier Chasseur à Cheval at the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, Montbron endeared himself as a conscientious leader and aggressive commander. He rose quickly through the ranks. By 1804, Général de Brigade. Montbron was considered one of the finest cavalrymen in France. Marbot described him as, quote, a splendid man in the same style as Marat, lofty stature, a scarred face, a black beard, of soldierly bearing, and an admirable horseman. Leading his brigade through Saxony, Silesia, and Poland, Montbron eventually wound up in Spain. At the Battle of Somosierra, Montbron performed his most enduring feat. Napoleon called upon his Polish Guard lancers to clear a ridgeline of Spanish infantry and cannon. They attacked with great élan, but faltered under fire in a narrow gorge. Regrouping in the plains below, Napoleon sent Montbron to retrieve the situation. Marbot recounts the event. Quote, having made the squadrons take their intervals, and seeing that everything was in proper order, Montbrun placed himself boldly at their head and dashed into the gorge. Some squadrons were at first shaken by the fire, but as the different parts of the column were at sufficient distances to prevent any serious disorder, they recovered, and presently the top of the ascent was reached. General Montbrun dismounted and was the first to run up the entrenchments to tear out the palisades under a hail of bullets. The Poles followed his example. The entrenchments were carried, and the regiment, remounting, charged the Spaniards, causing great slaughter, for the ground, opening out and sloping down, allowed the lancers to reach the enemy's infantry as they fled in disorder. By the time the Emperor reached the top, not only was the French flag to be seen floating above Buitrago, but Montbrun's cavalry was pursuing the routed Spaniards a league beyond the town. For his exploits, Montbrun was promoted to Général de Division and made an imperial count. He would serve subsequently in the 1809 campaign against Austria. At the Battle of Raab, Montbrun covered the left flank of the French army as it advanced. The Austrians fired everything they had at him, but could not dissuade Montbrun as he wheeled and charged. The demonstrations disorganized the Austrian right so completely that subsequent French attacks broke through. Then during a stint in Portugal, Montbrun routed a British brigade at the Battle of Busaco. Normally his charge first, ask questions later policy paid off, but in the subsequent withdrawal at Alciente, Montbrun was dealt his first defeat, a debacle where he failed to control his demoralized troops. But Montbrun was back at the head of his lancers for the 1812 campaign, only to be killed at Mogiasc. As Montbrun's leadership shows, disciplined lancers could be supremely dangerous to France's enemies. In his History of the Peninsular War, Charles Oman describes the famed charge of the Polish lancers at Albuera. Quote, Le Tour-Mort-Bord, having watched the struggle on the hillside before him, and, when he saw it going badly for his friends, directed his nearest cavalry regiments, which chanced to be the 1st Lancers of the Vistula and the 2nd Hussars, to charge along the slopes against the exposed outer flank of Colborne's brigade. The morning was disturbed by a blinding shower of rain and hail coming from the north. It is said to be largely in consequence of this accident that the approach of the 800 horsemen was unnoticed by any of the British infantry. At any rate, the charge of the 3rd Regiment rolled them up, and then swept down the back of the other 2 battalions and onto Cleves' battery. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that Colborne's 3 leading battalions were annihilated in 5 minutes. 58 officers out of 80, 1,190 men out of 1,568 were slain, wounded, or captured. The number of killed was out of all proportion to the wounded. 479 prisoners, many wounded, were driven off to the French lines. The brigade lost 5 of its 6 colours and the 4 guns of Cleves' battery. It didn't pay to underestimate the lancers. Napoleon certainly didn't. That's why he invested in them as heavily as he did. Lancers were highly versatile, uncommonly brave, and very dangerous. As we've seen with the formation of the Lancier regiments, the Dragoons had a troubled existence in French service. Dragoons, Dragons in French, stemmed from a long tradition in European armies of mounting infantry on saddle and workhorses, literally unfit for service as war horses. The idea was that they would not fight mounted like proper cavalry, but instead dismount to fight on foot, the horses simply a means of expediting advance or retreat. Given this mobility, Dragoons had taken on a variety of roles, but in the main tended to specialise in escort, guard and garrisoning duties. However, Dragoons were in an odd place. On the one hand, they were fairly ineffective infantry, without the mass or firepower to prove decisive, and they were poor cavalry, with smaller, slower horses that were at a severe disadvantage against proper cavalry, mounted on true thoroughbreds. By the 18th century, most European armies mounted their dragoons on war horses as a budget alternative to full-blown cuirassiers. That being so, most were still treated as mounted infantry to fight on foot when needed. In French service, the dragoons no longer fought dismounted at all. Why would they? Dragoons could screen, scout and escort like light cavalry, and hold their own in a melee like the heavy cavalry. Napoleon personally was an advocate of the dragoons as cavalry first, as were practitioners like Thiers, Wattier and Grouchy. Opponents tended to come from the heavy cavalry, who were wary that dragoons might give them a run for their money. Auguste Marmont was a particular opponent, stating that, quote, they ought to have remained infantry, Otherwise, the aspirations and pretension of colonels will soon convert them into cavalry, and they will become both bad infantry and bad cavalry. The cavalry crowd won out, and the dragoons remained mounted, albeit on second-rate horses. At the time of the French Revolution, France had 18 dragoon regiments, the first founded in 1635, the latest 1744. The National Assembly reorganized these regiments in 1791. Two more regiments, the 19e and the 20e, would be formed in 1793 by amalgamating volunteer units. In 1796, the 21e Regiment of Dragoons was founded, incorporating a Piedmontese dragoon regiment. The next 6 dragoon regiments, from the 22e to the 27e, were founded under Napoleon's consulship in 1803 as conversions from Grosse Cavalry Regiments. The final 3 regiments, the 28e through to the 30e, were formed from cadres taken from Hussar regiments. The result of all of this was that by the time the Grande Armée was being formed in the coastal camps of northern France, Napoleon had a whopping 30 dragoon regiments at his disposal. Given a shortage of horses, one of the cavalry branches was going to have to draw the short straw. Light cavalry were the army size and ears, heavy cavalry the iron gauntlet. Unavoidably, Napoleon determined that several dragoon regiments should return to their traditional role as mounted infantry. In this way, he had an outlet for smaller, slower horses, freeing up the better animals for the light and heavy cavalry. Given this reversion, dragoons had to be equipped both as cavalry and infantry, leading to a unique combination of uniform and equipment. The petite tenue was standard fare, a sleeveless, high-collared waistcoat worn with overalls and breeches. The grande tenue for all dragoons was fairly consistent too. All wore a green or white coat, regiments differentiated by black, white, red, blue or gold facings on the lapel, collar and sleeves. A white sash was worn across the body, a crossguard when dismounted. Woolen pantalons à cheval were meant to be worn, but in practice replaced by standard white, grey or brown infantry pantalons, just braided with regimental colours. Like all horsemen, dragoons wore cavalry boots and spurs. When dismounted, they would wear gaiters over the boots and ditch the spurs. The only truly unique part of the dragoon uniform was their distinctive brass helmet, a version of the iconic Cuirassiers helmet. To differentiate their helmet further, some regiments, and especially the first companies, inlaid leopard print, fur, leather, or plates of gold and silver. Long, flowing horsehair plumes mounted at the top of the helmet's fluted ridge were the dragoons' main badge of office. Equipment-wise, dragoons carried the eponymous fusil de dragon, the dragoon musket. Napoleon insisted each man carry a bayonet too, even when mounted, much to the consternation of the veterans. Slung from the hip was the dragoon broadsword, a long, heavy, straight-edged weapon with a handguard. It was useful both in self-defense and in melee fighting, but proved especially effective against infantry, where the weight of the sword could cause fatal wounds with even a single strike. Pistols were an official part of the dragoon package. Entire braces were often carried, ready to be discharged at a moment's notice. At the outset of the 1805 Ulm campaign, Napoleon only had enough horses to mount 3 out of every 4 squadrons in a given dragoon regiment. The mounted dragoons fought in the Cavalry Reserve, generally as their own medium cavalry division, though they were also often brigaded with the light cavalry. Dismounts were organised into 2 infantry divisions of 3,000 men apiece. Napoleon initially hoped to mount these dragoons on captured horses from England, but contented himself with the equine bounty of Austria and later Prussia and Poland. All French cavalry regiments sustained heavy losses to man and animal during the 1807 Polish campaign. In the aftermath, hard decisions had to be made, and as we've seen, several dragoon regiments to be converted to lancers and the dismounted squadrons stripped away. Cited was the poor performance of the dragoons so far. In the 1805 and 1806 campaigns, French dragoon divisions fought decently, but faced problems with demoralization and disorder. Generally, the veterans were the first to be dismounted, presumably because they'd make better infantry. Given the paucity of horses, many had attachments to their mounts. After serving in the dismounted squadrons, they might discover that the horses were dead, hurt, or worse yet, poorly cared for. In the extreme, some were deliberately maimed by their new owners, who'd stuff rocks under the saddle in an attempt to invalid their animal. Combat-wise, dragoons on subpar horses were outmatched in cavalry-on-cavalry fights. Their horsemanship left much to be desired, as infantry training took precedence. In truth, the dragoons were compromised by their status as the neglected junior cavalry branch. Dragoons, especially when dismounted, were admonished with the moniker of wooden swords. The outbreak of campaigning in Iberia then seemed like it would be more of the same. But despite a wobbly start, here the 24 dragoon regiments sent south were in their element. Dragoons were preferred as they were hardy and responsive. Where the light cavalry were vulnerable to ambushes, dragoons could dismount and fight on foot, pursuing their enemies into the hills and forests. Dragoons also led or screened columns, escorted officials and generals, and kept lines of communications patrolled. Their smaller horses were hardy, nimble, and needed less care. Indeed, unlike with the light and heavy cavalry, Portuguese and Spanish remounts were viable alternatives to thoroughbred French or German war horses. Dragoons also proved excellent for policing and garrisoning the many Spanish towns and cities, crushing the revolt of Madrid, for example. The rising confidence of the dragoons was, however, dealt a stinging blow. Just as the heavy and light cavalry were denuded in preparation for the 1812 campaign, so too were the dragoons. In 1811, as we've seen, Napoleon converted 6 dragoon regiments into lancers. Though reduced in size, the payoff was the dragoons escaped the 1812 experience, save for 2 regiments, the 7th and the 30th. The strain was felt by the remaining regiments, now burdened with ever-expansive duties, especially in Spain. All dragoon regiments were in continuous, active use from 1804 to 1814. Officer casualties in the 13th Regiment paints the picture. There was not a single year they didn't have an officer killed or wounded, for a total of 8 dead, 54 wounded. By 1813 and 1814, the valiant dragoon regiments had reached maturity. Though exhausted and often reduced to less than half strength, these were hardened professional units that were preferred for screening and withdrawal. The oldest hands of the dragoons were its original commanders, Emmanuel Grouchy and Barragui Delier. A son of the noblesse d'épée, Grouchy gravitated to military service, educated in the École Polytechnique at Strasbourg, later serving in various volunteer companies as a convinced Republican. Born to the saddle, he served as a colonel of Hussars, Chasseur à Cheval, and finally, in the 12th Dragoons. Of all the cavalry branches, the dragoons were certainly his calling. A général de division by 1795, Grouchy would go on to serve in Italy, the Vendée, Germany, and Holland. He commanded the 12th Dragoon Division of the Cavalry Reserve from 1805 to 1807. As the dragoons moved to Spain, so did Grouchy, commanding them against Spanish guerrillas and British regulars alike. He returned to fight in the War of the Fifth Coalition against Austria, earning distinction and a promotion to Corps Commander for 1812. Surviving the ordeal, he fought bravely in the 1813 and 1814 campaigns, before finally commanding the Cavalry Reserve in the 100 Days Campaign, after being made Marshal, of course. In this final trial, Grouchy was found wanting, but nonetheless is rightly regarded as one of the era's finest cavalry commanders, notable for his level-headedness and steadfast loyalty. Like any self-respecting cavalryman, Grouchy had a couple of close brushes with death. In 1807, at the Battle of Eylau, Grouchy's horse was shut out from under him, crushing him under its weight. Quote, cruelly injured, in his own words, were it not for a brave rescue by one of his aides, he would surely have been, quote, hacked to pieces by the enemy who was on our heels. At the Battle of Borodino, at the head of a charge, he was nearly cut in half by grape shot, only dodging out of the way at the last instant. Barragui Delier's career path started very much the same as Grouchy's, with école education, service as an aide-de-camp, and rapid promotion, made général de division by 1796. Serving in Italy, Germany, and Egypt, Delier was noted for his courage and diligence. In that time, he liaised with and oversaw several cavalry units, but never once served in one. His true calling was not to the saddle, but in organisation and administration. During Napoleon's initial invasion of Italy, he'd appointed Delier as military governor of Venice, where he showed both a general's firmness and a definite grasp of the intricacies of politics. Delier also excelled as an inspector of infantry, and it was in this way he came into contact with the dragoons for the first time, conducting their infantry training and some horsemanship drills. He trained them hard and he trained them well. There's an anecdote that Dillier told his dismounted dragoons that, if they stood their ground in a well-formed cavalry square, they were unbreakable. At the same time, he told the mounted dragoons that if they charged home hard and fast, their attack was irresistible. They had a chance to find out as Dillier took command of the 1st Dragoon Division in 1804. While the dismounted regiments guarded the baggage, Dillier led the dragoons in Ney's Cavalry Reserve. Returning to Italy in 1806, he organised the Italian Corps of the Kingdom of Italy and resumed his governorship of Venice. Against Austria in 1809, he joined Massena's Franco-Italian army, once again at the head of the dragoons. From 1810 he served in Spain and then in the 1812 campaign. Like Grouchy, Dillier struggled with corps command. His mishandling of 9th Corps saw him suspended from service. He died of illness on his way back to Paris in 1813. Aside from these two, several effective generals of division and brigade served in dragoon regiments. They included Pierre Wattier, Édouard Milhaud, Horace Sébastiani, Jacques-Marie Cavaignac, Raymond Saint-Sulpice, Jean-Joseph Sauget, and Jacques-Louis Tilly. Louis Bonaparte briefly served as the colonel of the 5e Dragoons in Italy, but thankfully was kept from doing any real harm. On the opposite end of the Nepo scale, Auguste Jean-Gabriel Caulaincourt was a chef d'escadron of the 19e Dragoons from 1800 to 1806, and would die leading the attack on a Russian redoubt at Moscow. In the right hands, dragoons proved a highly versatile fighting force, absolutely able to go man-to-man with the best of the coalition cavalry. At the Battle of Arab, Grouchy recalled a charge by the 7e and the 30e regiments. Quote, an Austrian cavalry column advancing from Raab to retreat towards Canova was charged by the 30th Dragoons. 2 enemy squadrons were driven back into Raab, and the remainder, against which I directed, by a flanking manoeuvre, the 7th Regiment and the Queen's Dragoons, owed their survival only to the speed of their horses and the shadows of night. Several White Dragoons and Hussars were nevertheless captured, and 2 by the very hand of my aide-de-camp, Carbonel. On the 15th I pursued the enemy jointly with General Montbrun, and took 500 to 600 prisoners from them. This is a rather laconic account of the action. Under Grouchy's expert direction, the 7e and the 30e had withstood heavy enemy fire all day, covered the charge and withdrawal of the 8e Hussars, and then blunted a final counterattack meant to cover the retiring Austrian army. He would repeat the feat a few days later at Wagram, commanding the heights of Nutzitzel against 60 Austrian cavalry divisions. As French infantry closed ranks to repel a mass charge, Grouchy flanked and charged, accounting for 400 killed or captured enemy. Grouchy recalled with satisfaction, quote, these charges were driven to the fullest extent and executed with rare coordination. Cuirassiers had by far the longest standing in French service. Combining prowess and prestige, Cuirassiers were deemed the definitive cavalry branch in service with the Kingdom of France. Given their close association with the Ancien Régime, the Cuirassiers were hit hard by defection and desertion. Skeletons remained of once proud units. In the opening years of the Revolutionary Wars, heavy cavalry were watered down, usually folded into light and medium cavalry units or brigaded together. Only around 1800 had the heavy cavalry been sufficiently revived, reorganised as 25 demi-brigades of cavalerie grosse, literally heavy cavalry. Upon becoming consul, Napoleon reformed the heavy cavalry again, abolishing 7, their horses and numbers amalgamated into just 12 demi-brigades. The remaining 6 were converted into dragoons, as we've seen. In 1804, as per the reorganisation of the army generally, demi-brigades were replaced by regiments, and the cavalerie grosse redesignated as cuirassiers. Not only was the name a throwback, it was a practical description of their equipment. The expense of outfitting entire regiments with a cuirasse, a steel plate shell with chainmail epaulettes that protects the core and back of the wearer, was considerable. Thick coats and multiple layers were good enough most of the time. However, Napoleon deemed the expense of his new cuirass worth the cost if it meant his new cuirassier would contend with a cream of coalition cavalry, most of whom wore merely a breastplate. That said, a full cuirass was heavy, cumbersome, and a massive pain in the arse, especially on long campaigns. Opinions among French officers were divided. Marat, Ney, and Kellerman were strong proponents, but light cavalrymen generally scorned the loss in manoeuvrability. A rolled cloth or coat worn around the chest weighed little and could stop a blow just as surely. Objectors also noted the expense and instances of cuirass discarded during retreats. The Cuirassiers themselves did not share these opinions. Many attested to their lives being saved only by good armour. Marbot considered the matter settled when the Austrian and French Cuirassiers clashed at Wagram. Quote, "This fight settled a question which had been long debated as to the necessity of the double cuirasses, for the proportion of Austrians in their half breastplates, wounded and killed, amounted respectively to 8 and 13 for one Frenchman. When proposals were made to perhaps re-examine the efficacy of the Cuirassiers were the first to threaten mutiny. Without their armour, they'd be little more than dragoons, and death was preferable to that humiliation." Worn for head protection was a big brass helmet, replete with a horsehair plume and raised crest. All Cuirassiers Grande tenue were blue, with white pantalons. Epaulettes were generally red or gold. The commonality of the Cuirassier uniforms ended up causing trouble. With a long and proud history, Cuirassier veterans could recall times when they'd each had a distinct regimental uniform. Resistance to the initial rollout was fierce, with some regiments simply refusing to don the blue uniforms, even if they happily donned the cuirass. Jean-Baptiste Merlin, colonel of the 8e Regiment, even substituted his own uniform designs, declaring that his regiment was in fact the Premier Regiment, since once upon a time they'd been the Premier Cuirassiers du Roi of the Ancien Régime. Parochialism and snobbishness like this were common for the Cuirassiers, who considered themselves, and no others, as the best horsemen in French service. Much of this was not so much a holdover from the Ancien Régime, but a revival from the few officers, like Merlin, who had served before the Revolution. Most referred to themselves by their old royal monikers. The Premier Regiment, the real one that is, were the Cuirassiers de Saxe-Weimar, the 4e Regiment de la Reine, the 11e Regiment the Royal Roussillon. This royalist flair showed up in the grooming of the Cuirassiers, who wore long moustaches reminiscent of the Cavaliers of old, and short queues reaching down to the nape of the neck. Cuirassiers were officially recognised as élite, on par with the Imperial Guard, and bore the exploding grenade on their saddlecloth and helmets. Extra pay and privileges might sate the Cuirassiers for a time, but never truly plugged their deep well of pride. It wasn't without good cause they were so boastful, though. Cuirassiers' intended role was as the premier shock force in the French army, a role in which, to be fair, they had no equal. Encased in steel, they could chew through enemy cavalry, and against infantry, a long, heavy broadsword chopped and crunched. Pistols were standard kit, 2 per man, carried in a brace or at the pommel. As Cuirassiers were increasingly called upon to perform scouting and foraging duties, they were given a mousqueton, a slightly shortened version of the Chaleville. Sheer mass was their greatest asset, and Cuirassiers remained consistently brutal in a charge. Accounts attest that even against well-disciplined troops, Cuirassiers could pummel through, swing around, and scythe through again, obliterating anything in their path. That said, Cuirassiers had their vulnerabilities. The cuirass was not reliably bulletproof. Test designs could stop a musket ball which deflected off the angled surface. However, in battlefield conditions, the armour was proof against only splinters and bullets when they were sapped of energy. Helmets had similar woes. Early models saw corners cut in their construction, thus that they split, like logs, with not much more than a glancing blow. The swords were well built, but hard to sharpen, and didn't fit properly in their scabbards. Boots, too, were a problem, big and bulky things. Marbot recalled how we saw a Cuirassier's horse killed in a charge, with the young lieutenant unable to keep up on foot in an ungainly waddle. He was later seen run through by a lance halfway through removing the boots. As these examples show, cost was the Achilles heel of the Cuirassiers, as their performance rarely justified their expense. Napoleon had cause to constantly look for ways to economise, preferring light cavalry largely for this reason alone. It turns out there was a reason the Russian, Prussian and Austrian armies had few Cuirassiers outside of their Garde or prestige units. The British only adopted them to chase a trend. Many of Napoleon's allies replicated Cuirassier regiments in their own armies, with mixed results. For one regiment of Cuirassiers, 2 regiments of light cavalry could be raised and maintained. Mounts also had to be much larger, taller, and trained as war horses, which were very expensive to rear and in short supply already. only one new Cuirassier regiment, the 13e, would be raised by Napoleon in 1807. The 14e Regiment was formed in 1810 by the amalgamation of the two Dutch Cuirassiers after the annexation of Holland. The Dutch Cuirassiers, for a little while at least, got to keep their stark white coats with blue facings, until outfitted to the regimental standard. The culture of the Cuirassiers mellowed over the course of the Napoleonic Wars. They never lost that quintessential pride, but after 1809 became more closely aligned with Napoleon and the standards he imposed. Now with a few imperial campaigns under their belts, the Cuirassiers forgot their old allegiance. Royalist officers died or retired, queues were cut, moustaches trimmed. Improvements to the uniform and equipment were also popular. An 1809 pattern of broadsword, helmet and cuirass resolved all the big issues the Cuirassiers had. Several Cuirassier colonels made general. Pierre Mageron, Jean-Antoine de France, Louis Choeur, Pierre Roland, Jean-Baptiste Laplanche, François Offenstein, Jean-Baptiste Merlin, Albert Foulet, and Guillaume d'Aigremont, just to name a few. All had some incredible deeds to their names. At Marengo, d'Aigremont held off a column of 1,300 Austrians. Overwhelmed, he was captured, only to escape 2 hours later. Suchet noted with satisfaction his service in Spain, quote, soon justified the most brilliant feat of arms. Far better known, verging on household names in our sort of circles, are several of France's prime cavalrymen whose associations and exploits with the Cuirassiers is legendary. Born in 1769, Jean-Louis d'Espagne was 23 when he took to the saddle, joining the 6e Demi Brigade of the Dragoons. He fought in France, Germany, ending up in Italy as an aide to Alexandre Dumas, a steely-eyed cavalry commander if ever there was. In 1796, Espagne was chef d'escadron of the 8e Cuirassiers, making Général de Brigade by 1799. Detached from the Cavalry Reserve in 1805, his regiment fought in Italy, earning him a bump up to Général de Division. At this point, d'Espagne was one of the finest Cuirassier divisional leaders, and fought with distinction in Germany and Poland. Throughout it all, he'd had many lucky escapes, but his luck ran out at Aspern-Essling. A testament to d'Espagne's sang-froid, when his bicorn was hit with a musket ball, he simply turned it around and carried on. Later in the day, another shot found its mark, and d'Espagne expired soon thereafter at Lobau. Another Cuirassier commander, Jean-Joseph d'Hautpoul, suffered a similar fate. A volunteer from the Languedoc, d'Hautpoul commanded dragoons during the Revolutionary Wars. Promoted to Général de Division in 1797, he from then on led Cuirassiers, cementing a reputation as a commander of incredible bravery. His greatest charge was at Austerlitz, where, in command of the 2nd Cuirassier Division, he led the attack that broke the centre of the Russian line and relieved the pressed Imperial Guard. In Poland, during the Battle of Hof, Napoleon sent forward first the light and then the medium cavalry to clear the Russians from a strong position accessible only by a narrow bridge. Both were repulsed with heavy losses. It fell to d'Hautpoul to make it happen. Quote, Napoleon ordered forward d'Hautpoul's formidable Cuirassiers, who, crossing the bridge and the ravine under a hail of bullets, fell upon the Russian line with such swiftness that they literally laid it flat. The slaughter was fearful. The Cuirassiers, furious at the losses sustained by their comrades of the Hussars and Dragoons, nearly exterminated the 8 Russian battalions. All were killed or taken prisoners. The field of battle was a horrible sight. Never was a cavalry charge so completely successful. To testify his satisfaction with the Cuirassiers, the Emperor embraced their general in presence of the whole division. D'Hautpoul exclaimed, quote, The only way to show myself worthy of such an honour is to get killed in your Majesty's service. The general was as good as his word, though a little testy. The next day, at the Battle of Eylau, d'Hautpoul clashed not only with the Russians, but his emperor. Reportedly, Napoleon ordered a manoeuvre at an unsuitable angle. D'Hautpoul fired back, declaring that, quote, There is nothing in the art of handling cavalry that the emperor can teach me. At this he rode off, launching hours of destructive charges, only to have a leg riddled with grape shot. In the subsequent operation he died. Had he lived, d'Hautpoul would likely have been made marshal. Such was Napoleon's opinion of him, which no outburst could diminish. As we've seen, the Cuirassiers stuck to the ways of the Ancien Régime longer than most. Etienne-Nicolas, an old-fashioned mousquetaire gris, embodied this tradition wholeheartedly. He forbade the shaving of queues in his regiment, and after returning from leave to find his officers had gone over his head, literally slapped each and every one of them and had them arrested. Nosworthy owed his atavism to a traditional military education, part and parcel for the noblesse d'épée. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary Wars, he led a Chasseur à cheval demi-brigade, transferring to the 9e demi-brigade of the Cuirassiers in 1793. Leading his unit through Germany and the Rhineland, his rise to prominence came in 1803 when promoted to Général de Division. Subsequently, he was appointed to the Cuirassier division of the Cavalry Reserve. From Ulm to Austerlitz to Auerstedt, then Eylau to Friedland, Nosworthy led the Cuirassiers from the front. At Friedland, for example, Nosworthy's efforts staved off the entirety of the Russian cavalry from turning Lannes's flanks in the critical opening hours. For his services, Nosworthy was made a count and promoted Premier Écuyer, the first equerry or stablemaster of the imperial maison. Nosworthy's fine record was polished further with excellent service against the Austrians and a stint of administrative duties as inspector of cavalry. In the 1812 campaign, Nosworthy commanded the Cavalry Reserve, being wounded badly in the knee at the Battle of Borodino. During the retreat, he yielded to Bruyères and escorted a convoy of wounded ahead of the main force. During the German and French campaigns of 1813 and 1814, Nosworthy was again in the saddle as commander of the cavalry of the Imperial Garde. Wounded at Montmirail and Craonne, Nosworthy was invalided, having served, with distinction near continuously, in pretty well near every major action of the Grande Armée. Not yet 50, his tired and battle-scarred body gave out in February 1815. No doubt, had he lived, he would have been at Waterloo. Two names stand head and shoulders above the rest of the Cuirassiers, though. Native of Cahors, Joachim Murat was destined, for at least a time, for the life of a priest. Given what we know about the man he'd become, it's no surprise he racked up quite the bill gambling and drinking, and so the story goes, fearing more the wrath of his father than the debtors, joined the Chasseur à cheval as a soldier. Later, Murat transferred to the Constitutional Guard of King Louis, sanctioned successor to the Royal Guard. Despite a lack of formal training, Murat was literate and lively, taking to cavalry life instinctively. Citing political differences, though mostly due again to gambling and drinking, Murat left the Guard and returned to the regular army. By 1792, he was commanding a squadron of the 11e Chasseurs à cheval. After a few other postings and transfers, as well as plenty of action against the Austrians, Murat was in Paris in 1795 during Napoleon's whiff of grape shot, in which he retrieved the cannon from the Champ de Sablon. Thereafter, Napoleon was a fixture at Napoleon's side, serving on his staff and commanding his cavalry. Murat was made a Général de Division for the Egyptian expedition, during which he launched his legendary cavalry attack at Aboukir, wiping out an army of 18,000. During the engagement, Murat came face to face with Mustafa Pasha, copping a shot to the cheek, but slicing off the hand that fired it. Napoleon held Murat in extremely high regard as a leader and soldier, but would be the first to admit that his brash and impetuous nature called for a short leash. Still, these were the ideal traits for a commander of cavalry, and Murat was given a marshal's baton and control of the Cavalry Reserve in 1804, at the head of which he would serve until 1807. By dint of his marriage to Caroline Bonaparte, Murat was a member of the imperial family, made Duke of Clèves-Berg in 1806 and King of Naples in 1808. He served in Spain, in Austria, in Russia, everywhere Napoleon was to be found over the next few years. Murat returned to Naples in 1813 to organise the defence of his kingdom. But since this isn't a biography of Murat's life, let's look at some of his exploits as a cavalry commander. During the opening phase of the Ulm campaign, during Le Grande Armée's plunge through the Schwarzwald, it was Murat's cavalry that overwhelmed the Austrian defenders. In 3 days, his corps accounted for 10,000 prisoners, 1,500 wagons, and over 50 cannon. The streak of success continued unabated for the remainder of the campaign. Flags, prisoners, and wins aplenty. Murat was instrumental in defeating the Prussians at Jena, and reduced several fortresses in the interior. Napoleon was impressed. He quipped on October 31st, 1806, quote, "My brother, I congratulate you on the capture of Stettin. If your light cavalry takes fortified towns like this, I'll have to disband the engineers and melt down my heavy artillery. it wasn't only the French who admired Murat's spirit. Famously, he flirted with the Cossacks. At the height of the Russian retreat, many declared that they recognized neither the French emperor who fled Moscow, nor the Russian one who claimed it, but the King of Naples who took it. Our last Cuirassier cavalry commander born to the saddle was Michel Ney. An Alsatian from Saint-Louis, Ney was the son of a cobbler. He joined the army young and, through skill and wit, rose through the ranks of the 5e Hussars. The Revolutionary Wars brought with it the opportunity for distinction when Ney was talent-spotted and made a sous-lieutenant. A capitaine by 1794, he served around his homelands along the Rhine frontier on several detached commands. Wounded by a musket ball to the shoulder, Ney recuperated in France, returning in 1796 to be made a général de brigade. Under Napoleon, Ney was made a marshal and fought as général de division of the Cavalry Reserve. During the Austerlitz campaign, Ney was detached to pursue Archduke Charles into Tyrol and Austria, his first taste of corps command. He would command corps in Prussia, Germany, Poland, Russia, and Spain. He was among the first officers to suggest capitulation in 1814, and also among the first to return to Napoleon during the 100 Days. With Murat unavailable, Ney was called up to lead the French cavalry arm. A career of indescribable bravery came to a crashing end with the charge of the Cavalry Reserve at Waterloo, during which Ney had 7 horses shot out from under him. Though headstrong and often reckless, none could impugn Ney's courage. He earned his ducal title, the Duke of Elchingen, for an action fought in that town in 1805. In an amphibious assault across the Danube, French troops streamed into Elchingen in an attempt to relieve Dupont. As the Austrians were pinned and some withdrew, Ney swept around with his cavalry and drove them back into Mikkelsburg. Joined by Lannes, Ney then assaulted and seized that town. Subsequently, several forts and garrisons lost heart, Ney racing one to the other to induce their surrender. Then during the Thuringia campaign, Ney again excelled. Le brave des braves, the brave of the braves. Living up to the reputation, Ney fearlessly commanded his cavalry in Russia. Leading the rear guard, he was isolated and his corps thought destroyed after the Battle of Krasno. Ségur recounted that, quote, "At every moment, Ney's name escaped Napoleon's lips with exclamations of pain." In a 3-day running battle with Cossacks and the elements, Ney broke through the Russian cordon to rejoin the army. He resumed the rearguard at Kovno, quote, "alone and unshaken." For his rallying to Napoleon in 1815, Ney was sentenced to death. Accounts from peers, friends, and even enemies, and a spirited defence did not avail. In the finest tradition of the Cuirassiers, Ney went to his death head held high, as though still astride the saddle. We arrive now at the final branch of the cavalry arm, the Carabiniers à cheval. The Carabiniers were an old, proud, but small component of the French cavalry. Originally founded under the reign of Louis XIV, they were a prestige cavalry force, composed of hand-picked members from regular cavalry regiments. Carabiniers served as the more practical everyday sibling to the royal household cavalry, escorting the royal family and fighting, when needed, in the line of battle. Their strength remained at 1 regiment until a second was formed in 1788. Given their royal status and officer corps consisting entirely of minor nobles, it might be presumed that the Carabiniers would evaporate like the Cuirassiers. But instead, the 2 regiments fought, brigaded together, with exceptional zeal and singular commitment to the revolutionary cause. As their name suggests, Carabiniers à cheval were mounted carabiniers. However, they were designated as grosse cavalerie and fought alongside the Cuirassiers in shock action. In the attempt to reform the French heavy cavalry, serious thought was given to disbanding or amalgamating the Carabiniers. A compromise was found when, in 1793, they were redesignated as Grenadiers à cheval, better reflecting their actual use as a shock force. The old royal chapeau was ditched for a stylish grenadier shako. It was these 2 Grenadiers à cheval demi-brigades Napoleon inherited in 1800. By 1803, they'd been reorganised as regiments and returned to being Carabiniers à cheval. Unlike the Cuirassiers, which had a clear use case, Carabiniers were a little bit adrift. On paper, they did nothing which cannot be done by either heavy or light cavalry. They also considered themselves elite, never forgetting their privileged pre-revolutionary status. Napoleon confirmed their elite status, but could not justify independent regiments. In practice, from 1804 to 1800, Carabiniers deployed alongside Cuirassiers, sometimes detaching their companies. The deal suited no one. Cuirassiers resented sharing the spotlight with their chirpy younger siblings, while the Carabiniers resented the haughty Cuirassier. At every opportunity, Carabiniers endeavoured to distinguish themselves, and Napoleon took note. Defying stereotypes, Carabiniers were diligent, attentive, didn't make a fuss about mixed duties, and made do with what they got. In several battles, Carabiniers were consistently among the most heavily engaged cavalry. In 1809, Napoleon rewarded the Carabiniers with a reform that officialised their distinction with new uniforms and better equipment. Basic kit, the petite tenue, was part of the course: pantalon, vest, coat, etc. Prior to the reforms, Carabiniers wore bleu impérial coats with red cuffs and collars, basically the same as the Cuirassiers. They maintained the Grenadiers' bearskin shako despite its impracticality as headwear, being neither protective and prone to blowing away in a charge. Crossbelts were white with ochre highlights. But after 1809, the blue coat was exchanged for a white one, despite Napoleon's preference that the coat be red. In practice, it only went to members of La Musique and a handful of officers. Only the crossbelt remained the same, mostly to save paying for a new pattern. The shako was swapped for a cuirassier's helmet and a cuirasse fitted with brass and copper. After all this, at a glance, there was little to denote the Carabiniers as a unique unit. Indeed, most Carabiniers now contended that they'd been transitioned into cuirassier in all but name, which was likely Napoleon's intent. For parades and in garrison, Carabiniers played along, but on campaign the old blue coats returned, as did the shako on occasion. In 1812, 1813 and 1814, Napoleon wasn't making much of a fuss about this bending of the rules. He needed every man in the saddle. Weaponry remained consistent throughout. Carabiniers always carried pistols and the dragoon broadsword. The fusil de Dragon was the primary weapon, slung on the back or at the side. While the Cuirassiers had 14 regiments, the Carabiniers had only 2. Given the similarity of their equipment and functions, Carabinier officers were often promoted or transferred to the Cuirassiers. For us, that means there aren't too many standout Carabinier officers as there are for the Cuirassiers, but there are a few. A volunteer from the Charente, François Laroche bounced around as a lieutenant of the 15e Cuirassiers and later the 25e Dragoons, before being promoted to capitaine after routing an Austrian cavalry regiment and capturing 2 of their cannon. Over the next few years, Laroche fought in the Rhineland and later in Germany. He was transferred to the Premier Régiment de Carabiniers à Cheval, just in time to serve in the Ulm and Austerlitz campaigns. In 1806, Laroche was finally made colonel of his regiment and a baron for good measure. At Regensburg in 1809, he was among the 7 officers of his regiment wounded in that campaign, copping a sword blow to the head. Laroche was a général de brigade during the 1812 and 1813 campaigns. A previous colonel of the Premier Regiment, Antoine Christophe Choeur, might also be singled out as a prime example of the spirit of the Carabiniers. A son of the noblesse d'épée and a native of the Moselle, Choeur started his career in service with the artillery and logistical wings of the army, but in 1774 settled on the Carabiniers. A sous-lieutenant by 1791, he was capitaine the next year. At Neukirchen, leading his squadron, Choeur relieved a surrounded band of French Hussars, chasing away their Austrian opponents, only to come under the fires of a nearby battery. Quote, "So much the better," he said. "Where there's cannon fire, there's more glory." At Aven-le-Sec, attacking with, quote, "more audacity than prudence," as was Choeur's way, he led his squadron to a total success over an Austrian cavalry regiment. During the engagement, the enemy colonel took a pistol shot at Choeur, missed, and was run through by his target instead. I could go on. Choeur had some incredible exploits to his name. But notably, he did what he could not only to stay captain, despite being offered a chance to be a chef d'escadron of the 6e Dragoons. Eventually, though, in 1799, he finally took command of his beloved Carabiniers as a général de brigade. Choeur was still recovering from a pistol wound in his back sustained during the Ulm campaign when he was promoted. Injury and hard service finally caught up with him. He only reluctantly left active service in 1806, but transferred to command of the garrison of Lyon. A few other names stand out among the Carabiniers. Camille Borghese, husband to Pauline Bonaparte, served as colonel of the Premier Regiment after Choeur from 1805 to 1807. Armand Conductor, prior to his stint in the Cuirassiers, was a colonel of the Carabiniers. Light, medium or heavy cavalry, for all, the standard provision of basic cavalry tack looked mostly the same. A sheepskin saddlecloth, called a shabraque, was layered over the back of the mount. Atop went a leather saddle and stirrups. The horse bit was made of a bridle, chambron, and surcingle linked by snaffles and bradoons. I have no idea what these are, but I'm sure they must be important. In their portmanteau, all cavalrymen carried a horsebrush, various hair combs, a bag of oats, scissors, clips, and ties. For personal use, the cavalrymen carried in a musette bag stores and extras, much like with the infantry. Spare linen for repairs and bandages, sewing kits, extra rations, paper for rolling cigarettes or making cartridges, kitchen utensils, spare leather, another pair of boots or gloves, that sort of thing. Issued overcoats were decidedly oversized, meant to cover the rider and their saddle. It was a nuisance at times, but made for a handy bit of additional protection. Excepting the Cuirassiers, before battle, the overcoat was rolled up tight and worn slung across the body for added protection. Cuirassiers instead sensibly placed their rolled up coats between their groins and the pommel, lest any unfortunate accidents occur. Donned in the full panoply of war, cavalrymen could be heard long before they were seen by the jingle of their spurs and the coarseness of their swearing, and accompanied, of course, by a cloud of tobacco smoke and the stench of horse. Weaponry, as we've seen, depended on the unit. The fusil de dragon was standard for all cavalry, excepting the Chasseur à cheval and the Cuirassiers, who both carried a mousqueton. Most long arms were slung on the side of the horse in a sleeve. The standard cavalry pistol, the Modèle 1-13, was lighter and longer than the infantry version. It had no sights and was intended for point-blank firing. The pistol was carried on the pommel of the saddle for easy reach, sometimes carried in a brace along the chest. Non-regulation pistols, swords and daggers were very common and carried in any number of creative ways. Like the infantry, cavalrymen carried a giberne with 30 or so paper cartridges ready to fire. Though cavalry are closely associated with swords and lances, where possible musketry was preferred, especially for skirmishing actions. The Chasseur à cheval naturally considered their firearms their primary weapons. Capitaine Charles Denis Parcoin of the 20e Regiment of the Chasseurs à cheval recounts in his memoirs how effective cavalry fusillades could be. Quote, "About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an immense force of cavalry moved forward against us. Colonel Castex inquired if our carbines were loaded. On receiving an affirmative answer, he gave the order, quote, 'Carbines ready.' He next ordered the officers to fall into place in the column and then did so himself. Meanwhile, the huge mass of dragoons was steadily approaching us, still at a walk, Colonel Castex regarding them perfectly unmoved. Only when the Russians had approached within 6 paces of us did his voice ring out sharply, quote, 'Fire!' The effect of this one volley was terrific. Almost the entire front rank of the Russian dragoons was mowed down." Parcoin goes on to describe the ensuing melee, bloody and tense, in which the Chasseur repulsed the Russians, leaving 300 dead and wounded. As this account reminds, the cavalry made good use of les armes blanches, the white arms. The standard weapon of the light cavalry was the sabre de la cavalerie légère, itself based on a style of cavalry sabre known in France as the sabre hongroise. It was a completely typical sabre design for the era, between 80 and 90 centimeters long, covered by a metal handguard and completed by a longet, a little piece of metalwork that would guide the sabre into the scabbard. Depending on the preferences of the individual cavalryman or their company or regiment, the standard sabre's curvature might be too much. A popular alternative was the sabre à la Montmorency, which had a few extra inches and a less severe curve. Eventually, the designs for light cavalry sabres converged in 1802 with the sabre de chasseur and the sabre d'hussard. Medium and heavy cavalry were armed with the broadsword Modèle 1-11, forged in the armories at Klingenthal. Just under a metre long, weighted heavily, and boasting both a sharp tip and a frightening edge, the broadsword, in skilled hands, was brutally effective. The downsides were that it was heavy and cumbersome, requiring a lot of strength to wield properly. Prior to design revisions in 1806 and 1809, its scabbard was prone to bending and rattling. Dragoons got a nice leather version with no problems, while the Cuirassiers made do with the lathe, as they called their sword and scabbard combo. There were 2 lances standard for the lancers. The Polish lance was about 9 feet or 3 meters long, made of ash or walnut, an inch in diameter, and tipped with a piercing lance head. To keep the long weapon balanced, an iron shoe sat on the end. This also meant the lance could be braced on the ground, and there are stories of lancers either fighting with a lance dismounted, or their discarded weapons recovered and used on foot. A revised French model dropped the weight down from 7 pounds or a tad over 3 kilos to a lighter build with a slightly shorter length. All this talk of stabby things brings us on to the topic of their use. In the years since the Napoleonic Wars, copious amounts of ink have been spilled by military historians and theorists about which was more effective, the slash delivered by the edge of a sword or the thrusting stab upon its tip. Much empirical evidence has been proffered in the quest to learn which was best. British generals and observations in India and Central Asia, testaments from officers serving in the Balkans, reports about the swordsmanship of Circassians, Turks, Armenians, Serbians and Cossacks. Even the officers of Grande Armée were not immune. Antoine de Brack was a vocal proponent of the thrust. Quote, "It is the point alone that kills, the others serve only to wound." It all amounts to pointless argument. With the exception of the British cavalry, none of the contemporaneous armies of the Napoleonic Wars had any qualms about slashing 1 minute, thrusting the next, acknowledging the applicability of both. Based on their issued equipment, it would be easy to describe light cavalry, equipped with a sabre made for slashing, to predominantly slash. Likewise, given the long broadswords with a sharp tip, the medium and heavy cavalry must have thrust all day long. In truth, French cavalry used both techniques interchangeably and freely. Slashing was something of a default move, especially in co-altitudinal duel-like clashes between individual or small groups of cavalrymen. A shallow slash at an enemy could unbalance or expose a vulnerability, or quickly be transitioned into a block or riposte. Here the cuirass was very useful. A cuirassier could afford to strike with full power and only expose an armoured belly. Full power slashes like this, with the sword held high above the head, expose the body, but could hit the enemy horsemen from above or otherwise force them to raise their sword to counter. Slashes also had immense power owing to the weight of the blade and the inertia of a high starting strike. A full power slashing strike starts high and ends low, putting a great deal of force into a slicing motion. Well aimed into the backs of fleeing horsemen or infantry, this slashing motion was highly effective. All French cavalry carried their swords with their right hand, their enemies in general did the same. 2 clashing cavalrymen, when engaging from their respective fronts, would engage therefore with their right-hand side. French light cavalry, in particular, honed a technique where they maintained the momentum during the initial engagement, striking 1 short slash as they first passed, then rising from the stirrups, sword held high, to slash into the passing enemy's back. This backhand blow came in especially useful when outnumbered, as happened to Marbot in Spain. Quote, "I heard a rustling in the wood, and out came 2 English hussars, galloping to cut off my retreat. The 2 hussars were hitting me all over, chiefly on the head. In a few seconds my shako, my wallet and my pelisse were all in strips, though I was not myself wounded by any of their blows. At length, however, the elder of the 2 hussars, a grizzled older soldier, let me have more than an inch of his point in my right side. I replied with a vigorous backhander. My blade struck his teeth and passed between his jaws as he was in the act of shouting, slitting his mouth to the ears. He made off promptly, to my lively satisfaction, for he was by far the braver and more energetic of the 2. When the younger man found himself left alone with me, he hesitated for a moment. I pursued him for some paces and gave him a thrust in the shoulder, which quickened his speed. Thrusting, as Marbot employed it right at the end there, was extremely useful too. In cav-on-cav fights, a short thrust might be all that was possible when in a tight formation. It was not preferred, as the strike en tierce could leave an arm or shoulder exposed to a counterblow, but a short thrust could at least force an opponent to defend. Thrusts were also ideal during a charge. It kept the horsemen compact and concentrated the full effect of inertia into the sword point. Thrusting was also able to puncture armour if struck well, which a slash couldn't do. Even a thick coat was often enough to blunt or outright stop a sabre slash. Against enemy infantry who were resisting, a thruster delivered with the full length of the body and arm could generally overcome the length of the bayonet. A cavalryman had to be careful, of course, but if he could wheel around or get to the side of his target and thrust down, it could be a very short fight. Ultimately, finesse was what separated a skilled horseman from a beginner. Any man could slash or thrust, but preserving energy, waiting for an opportunity, that took experience. Overextending and thereby exposing the body was also a frequent and often fatal mistake committed by rookies. Learned the hard way was the sickening tendency for a well-struck blow to injure the striker with a sprained wrist. Skilled cavalrymen only put enough force in to hit their target, letting the weight and sharpness of the blade do the damage. This was also how swords were dropped or damaged, though most French cavalry tethered their weapons to their mount or to their arms. Despite the best efforts of the masters at arms at Saint-Germain, combat was by far the most effective teacher. As de Brack put it, quote, "Peace will teach you to handle weapons, war to use them." Memoirs of cavalry encounters are replete with exchanges, like Marbot's from before, of inexperienced cavalrymen being prey to their seasoned opponents. Uniform, weapons, tack and equipment, all fine things indeed, but what would a cavalryman be without his mount? France had historically been a not insignificant breeder of horses. Regions in the south and west of France provided high-quality stocks that, over the years, had been interbred with foreign strains to create a wide variety of horses available in France itself. The problem was not the quality of French horses, but the quantity. For military purposes, horses were needed in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, eventually the hundreds of thousands, and Napoleon could simply never rely on France's limited stocks, most of which went to serve the domestic market. A regiment was to have 3, ideally 4 remounts per man. Remounts were to be taken on campaign or deposited in depots not far from the front lines. From 1800 to 1806, Napoleon resorted to the exigency of having the demi-brigades and later regiments simply purchase their own horses through a remount fund. This process was both inefficient and hopelessly corrupt. In 1803, the question of remounts was again reaching critical levels, but no alternative could be found. Stud farms in France were simply not able to provide enough horses, either because they were still recovering or because their breeding stock had been ransacked and not replaced in the emergency days of the Revolutionary Wars. The solution devised was effective but slow. From 1806, all remounts were handled centrally through the Ministry of War Administration. François-Antoine Boursier, a brilliant administrator and keen-eyed horseman, was named Inspector General of Horses. Boursier negotiated with French horse breeders, establishing the commercial relations that provided steady work and reliable pay to keep the stud farms in business. Furthermore, investments were made to improve existing farms or revive old ones. Replacement strains of Arabian, Persian, Turkish, and German breeding stock were purchased in bulk or received as diplomatic gifts. Smooth sailing this was not, though. French horse breeders were notorious for their underhanded tactics. Stones or tacks might be placed under the saddle of a lame horse, spurring it to life. Analgesics or sedatives could calm a spirited animal enough to convince that it was tame. But Boursier had seen it all. Wise to the dirty tricks, and with an intrinsic sense for horses, he was expert in furnishing quality mounts for the army. In 1809, Bourcier's purview was expanded with 5 central depots in Versailles, Tours, Angoulême, Mont-de-Marsan, and Narbonne, answerable to him and commanded by hand-picked generals. 2 more depots were founded in Germany at Kassel and Potsdam. Much of Bourcier's job was to determine which horses went to which units. Ideally, heavy cavalry received the biggest and tallest horses, between 1.5 and 1.6 metres in height. Light and medium cavalry received smaller, fleeter horses, between 1.4 and 1.56 metres in height. Rather than custom-made saddles to the differently sized animals, blankets and straps were used to balance a one-size-fits-all saddle, greatly reducing costs. Despite all of these immense efforts and expenditures, the number of animals provided by French stud farms did not increase significantly during the Napoleonic Wars. They produced between 150 to 250,000 horses annually, most of which ended up in private hands. Recovery would prove to be a decades-long process that would benefit the Bourbons and the Orléans more so than the Bonapartes. There were 3 alternate ways to get your hands on a horse: those that were purchased from foreign sellers, those captured in war, and those requisitioned from allies and client states. Purchases of foreign horses, principally in Germany, accounted for between a quarter and a third of all French horses. German studs provided the most reliable source of remounts, albeit at a staggering cost. From 1804 to 1809, over 21 million francs. Requisitions from client states and allies provided animals usually of good quality and on short notice, but ticked off the state under the screws. Massive numbers of horses could be taken either in battle or during a peace deal. Almost the entire stocks of the Austrian and Prussian armies were folded into French service in 1805 and 1806. These stocks were handed directly over to the French government by treaty. Though officially all captured mounts were to be directed to depots as government property, in practice individual horsemen, often entire regiments, claimed ownership on account that it was their exploits and daring which had secured the fine animals. At this point they might remount themselves or sell the horses. Enterprising cavalry even saw the prospect of horse trading as a side hustle. Napoleon ordered a crackdown on all illicit horse trading, but had to be satisfied with an emergent compromise. Captured horses were first offered to the regiment, which took what it needed, and could depot the remainder or sell them off. Even when large numbers of horses were available in depot, the glut never lasted. When remounting the cavalry after losses sustained in 1806, Napoleon needed at least 7,000 horses to replace the immediate losses for the cavalry alone, let alone the 3,000 or so needed for the train and artillery. Furthermore, he ordered 16,000 more provisioned by Belsier to be sent into reserves. Fully 18,450 had been captured from Prussia and Saxony. However, only 8,000 of that number ended up in French regiments. The difference of 10,000 or so was squandered through a combination of corruption and greed, as officers and men sold, lost, or wasted the stock. German supplies and French studs had to make up the shortfall, but even then it was not enough to fully mount the cavalry. In all, 21,513 horses were procured from all sources, leaving a shortfall of roughly 4,000, with none for the reserve. With a final, massive wave of horse purchases, another 19,000 horses were procured from German studs, just in time for the 1807 Polish campaign. Horse losses in that campaign were staggering, around 80,000 animals, leading to a deficit of about 70,000 into 1808 and 1809. In total, from 1805 to 1809, 95,000 horses were lost among the cavalry, artillery, and train. In that same time period, just over 126,000 horses had been mobilized. Loss estimates for the 1812 campaign stack another 130,000 to 175,000 to the total. Then there's the loss figures for Spain, for which I don't have any numbers, but we can only presume they were just as horrid. Given the stupendous losses sustained by the cavalry, replacing their mounts for 1813 and 1814 was an uphill battle. The cavalry force had been halved again to around 34,000 troops, almost entirely dismounted, as depots from Warsaw to Hanover could provide a mere 5,000 remounts. Bulk purchases from German suppliers were ordered, though the pipeline from purchase to provision was at least a few months long. In that time, the Grande Armée was actively campaigning in Germany, upsetting the horse trade. Studs were damaged, sold their stables to the enemy, and otherwise reneged on their deals with the French government. Only the prosperous horse-rearing regions in Hanover and Hamburg remained productive, providing, within a few weeks, nearly 8,000 of the 9,000 animals purchased in January 1813. By comparison, within that same time period, the Brandenburg and Silesian depots provided a mere 1,500 animals from the 11,661 ordered. Around a quarter of the ordered animals were draft horses for the artillery and train, and of the war horses, most were sent to remount the desperately needed light cavalry. In April 1813, 20,000 war horses were needed to simply remount the cavalry, on top of the 30,000 or more Napoleon wanted so he could bring his cavalry force back up to an establishment strength of 64,000. The only way to furnish those numbers on short notice was confiscation. Starting in March, Westphalia and the eastern departments of France were scoured for any animals available for sale or which could be pressed into service. Little attention was paid to long-term sustainability or usual army standards. French studs were denuded of their young horses, not yet aged to the minimum 3 or 4 years required of a warhorse. Draft horses, when unavailable, were substituted for mules. Gradually, the wave of confiscation encompassed most of central and northern France, including Paris. Between November 1812 and December 1813, 212,671 horses were conscripted or confiscated for the Grande Armée, of which 80% were French in origin. Though excruciating, Bossier's tireless efforts paid off, remounting much of the French cavalry, artillery, and train. The problem then became cavalrymen, not horses, which the collapsing French recruitment and training system was unable to provide. A vast majority of French horses died not in battle or from wounds, but from malnutrition, dehydration, exhaustion, and extremes of temperature. French cavalry commanders didn't give much care to the practicalities of maintaining large bodies of horse, leaving that to the logisticians. Even as fine a cavalryman as Marat failed to adequately control the massive horse park of the Cavalry Reserve, with animals roaming and grazing freely. This led to health problems, as horses overate, ate unfamiliar foods, or got into mischief, breaking limbs and such. Amok horses could be just as much a danger to the men as to themselves. Witnessing one such event, Barquois recorded, quote, "During the hour of bivouac, and while our regiment was watering horses, one of the animals, running wild, dashed close to Colonel Castex, almost crippling him with a rearward kick. The colonel, noticing the horse's colour, that he must belong to the 2nd Squadron, ordered 2nd Lieutenant Grignon of the 2nd Squadron to have the horse caught and brought back to ranks, but the horse, revelling in its liberty, made a second gallop across the bivouac. The offending lieutenant's punishment is notable, so I'll include it here. Quote, annoyed to see his orders so loosely attended, the colonel placed Grignon under arrest. To order an officer arrested was to deprive him of his sabre. The young officer, terribly upset and grieved, approached the colonel and begged to have his sword. He pleaded that he had just exchanged into the regiment and that it was the first time his squadron would have a chance to see him face the enemy. Colonel Castex refused, and thus answered his appeal, quote, I have resolved to punish you, sir, and this is why your sabre is taken from you for the day. So it was not to prevent me from fighting the enemy, demanded Grignon. Without waiting for a reply, the lieutenant set to his spurs and, pistol in hand, dashed into the strife, where he speedily shot down one of the Austrian lancers. He next seized the dead man's lance and, thus equipped, went on charging the enemy. The same evening, the colonel complimented him publicly and returned his sabre. Escape and theft from free-roaming herds also took a severe toll on numbers, but conversely, if a French cavalry commander kept his animals tightly grouped, they would graze their enclosure bare and drink streams dry. Each cavalryman was given a 4 days' worth of oats and 2 days of hay bushels to feed their mount. Properly rationed, it was enough for a week or more, but the French tended to overfeed their animals, which placed a greater emphasis on foraging for fodder. Polish cavalrymen had impeccable horse-handling skills. They hand-fed their horses with cut grass, carefully managing their weight and rationing their oats. Indeed, Portuguese, Polish, Italian, and German units, lacking as many remounts as their French counterparts, generally took better care of their horses. They were often helped by the counterintuitive fact that they generally received second-rate animals, better adapted to shortages of food. While individual units or horsemen, and the veterinary staff, cared for and aided their animals to the best of their ability, in general, the French attitude towards horses was utilitarian. Horses are not patriots. They follow whoever feeds them. They were worked, worn out, and discarded. I'm reminded of the inscription on the wall of the Hyde Park Animals in War Monument, which reads, "They had no choice." Predictably, the rush for replacement animals was intense. When a depot was full up, regiments simply came by and took what they wanted, always more than they needed. Only by heavily systematizing the German depot network was this practice stamped out. Nothing could be done about horse thievery, though, an incorrigible problem. Infantry and train units were occasionally strong-armed into handing over their mounts, even if they weren't war horses. At least the infantry weren't meant to be mounted, but the train needed every animal they could get just as badly as the cavalry, or else supplies weren't going anywhere fast. The Imperial Guard could take their pick, then the heavy cavalry and the Chasseur à cheval. After them it was first come, first served, and the train rarely won that fight. The train, ambulance and artillery could make do with draft horses, even mules, but the cavalry needed strong, fast animals. Ideally, a warhorse was mature, around 5 years of age, and trained for war. This training was accomplished by the breeders usually, as it upped the price, though the French sent thousands of animals each year to be trained in their depots or at Saint-Germain. The point was to inure the animal to the sounds and smells of fighting. This was accomplished by exposing the animal to burnt flesh, running them through gauntlets of burning hay bales, and firing weapons close by. Handling was also important, and the best animals could recognize different signals and be managed with legs alone. French horses were not highly sought, save for a few Alsatian, Champenois, and Breton strains. Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian horses were generally small but tough. Same went for Iberian mounts. Italian breeds were mixed, some sublime, others quite poor. The best European breeds of the era were German. Mecklenburger, Alsatian, Rugener, Hanoverian, and Saxon steeds put all others to shame, being the trifecta of quick, brave, and sturdy. No French cavalryman would turn one down. Just before Saxony switched sides in 1806, the French cavalry dismounted their former foes. When Napoleon asked for Saxon cavalry to serve in 1807, they turned up on foot to find their old mounts still recognized them. Given what a pain in the neck it was to replace mounts, the French cavalry went to great lengths to keep living horses in the best possible health. The care of an individual horse fell upon its rider, for which he was issued basic horse care tack like a brush and comb, as we've seen. Inspections of the animals were frequent, especially after battles, and any wounded or sick immediately replaced. Those invalided animals were cared for by army veterinarians. All cavalry regiments had one in-house artiste vétérinaire, and a second after 1807. France was very fortunate in this regard. Its veterinary schools at Lyon and Alfort were probably the best in Europe, and integrated officially into the Ministry of War as École vétérinaire de l'Empire. Artiste vétérinaire could employ or deputize several aides vétérinaires. For good measure, each year, an NCO and an officer were plucked from each regiment to be trained as a médecin vétérinaire. The idea was that eventually, every officer in a cavalry regiment would be a semi-proficient vet. Those veterinary skills would come in handy with people too, setting a bone or bandaging a wound not too different between man and beast. Vets had their work cut out for them. Experiences at the Potsdam depot, specializing in Dragoon and Cuirassier remounts, were entirely typical. From its founding in October 1806 through to March 1807, Potsdam rehabilitated 12,600 horses. Injuries were tended, bones mended, and sicknesses cured. Epidemic was a constant worry, namely equine influenza, that could tear through a stable. Strict quarantining prevented outbreaks. Secondary depots at Wittenberg, Kulm, and Breslau managed overflow and fodder. Injuries from battle were one thing, neglect and carelessness another. French horseshoes were smooth and flat, which was fine on open ground, but sent horses tumbling in muddy or icy conditions. In 1807 in Poland and 1812 in Russia, this tendency caused unnecessary harm to many animals, with the vets left to pick up the pieces, sometimes literally. A bit of preventive medicine, as employed by the Poles, would have gone a long way. They shod their mounts with sharp horseshoes which gripped and girded. For these and other reasons, horses in Polish care fared much better. For example, one French Hussar regiment returned from Russia with only 4 animals, all officers' mounts. A Polish regiment in the same division returned with 100 horses, or about a quarter of their starting strength. Overall, the Napoleonic Wars were a miserable time to be a horse. European armies chewed through their equine stocks in the hundreds of thousands. But it wasn't all doom and gloom, and there absolutely were some fine, attentive French horse masters, Marbot being one. Searching for horses in the lead-up to the 1805 campaign, he recalled meeting Lisette. Quote, "A lovely mare, easy in her paces, as light as a deer, and so well broken that a child could lead her." Marbot got her at a steal, 1,000 francs, having cost the previous owner 5,000. But Marbot soon learned why. Lisette had a wild side, biting stable hands, strangers, and even Marbot himself. Quote, "I could quote 20 instances of her ferocity, but I will confine myself to one. While Marshal Augereau was staying at the chateau of Bellevue, near Berlin, the servants of his staff, having observed that when they went to get dinner, someone stole the sacks of corn that were left in the stable, got my aide to unfasten Lisette and leave her near the door. The thief arrived, slipped into the stable, and was in the act of carrying off a sack when the mare seized him by the nape, dragging him into the middle of the yard and trampling on him till she broke 2 of his ribs. At the shrieks of the thief, people ran up, but Lisette would not let him go till my servant and I compelled her. Francis Voland was that servant in question, a German in Marbeau's service who was a natural horse trainer. He succeeded in taming Lisette, after which she became tractable and docile to those she recognized. Voland doted on her in turn. Lisette carried Marbeau far and wide. She was cut badly at Jena, but healed, and then nearly blasted by cannon fire several times. But her true time to shine, and the one Marbeau recalls vividly, came at Eylau. After 2 of Napoleon's aides were dispatched with orders only to be killed on the way by Cossacks, it was Marbeau's turn. Quote, "Now, as my goal was the hillock occupied by the 14th Line Regiment, I resolved to get there without taking any notice of the Cossacks, whom in thought I abolished. This plan answered perfectly. Lisette, lighter than a swallow and flying rather than running, devoured the intervening space, leaping the piles of dead men and horses, the ditches, the broken gun carriages, the half-extinguished bivouac fires. Thousands of Cossacks swarmed over the plain, but none tried to stop me, first on account of the extreme rapidity of my pace, and also because, their numbers being so great, each thought that I could not avoid his comrades farther on. I escaped them all, and reached the 14th Regiment without either myself or my excellent mare having received the slightest scratch. Upon the hillock, the regiment was attacked, and Marbeau caught inside its defensive formation. A Russian officer with, quote, a hideous countenance, thundered that Marbeau be shot, presuming him to be the colonel of the regiment. Quote, a Russian grenadier, too drunk to stand steady, lost his balance, and the point of his bayonet went astray into my cloak. Seeing that I did not fall, the Russian aimed a great number of blows at me. These were at first fruitless, but one at last reached me, piercing my left arm, and I felt with a kind of horrible pleasure, my blood flowing hot. The Russian grenadier with redoubled fury made another thrust at me, but stumbling with the force which he put into it, drove his bayonet into my mare's thigh. Her ferocious instincts being restored by the pain, Lisette sprang at the Russian, and at one mouthful tore off his nose, lips, eyebrows, and all the skin of his face, making of him a living death's head, dripping with blood. Then hurling herself with fury among the combatants, kicking and biting, Lisette upset everything she met on her road. The officer who had made so many attempts to strike me tried to hold her by the bridle. She seized him by his belly, and carrying him off with ease, bore him out of the crush to the foot of the hillock, where, having torn out his entrails and mashed his body under her feet, she left him dying in the snow. The wounded Lisette carried her master away from the battle, only to succumb to blood loss. She fell, sending Marbeau careening into the snow. When Marbeau was found and evacuated, he was sure Lisette was among the thousands of dead horses lost that day. However, Lisette was made of sterner stuff. Voland found her and nursed her back to health. When Marbeau was up on his feet, he found Lisette happily munching down some hay. She was in fine form, and over the next few months put in splendid service, able to gallop at breakneck pace 12 miles a day. Her 3 years of hard service were well rewarded with a comfy retirement in 1808. Cavalry regiments prior to the Napoleonic Wars played a wonderful plethora of instruments, from lofty drums to blaring bassoons, even versions of the old Gallic carnix. By 1804, the standard instrument of the cavalry was the trumpet, in French the clairon. It was played by the regimental musique for a variety of signals: to horse, at attention, at ease, wheel left, wheel right, halt, etc. The most famous use of the trumpet was to signal an attack, usually a charge. At its call, the unit would respond avancé, or depending on the provenance of the regiment, los or schnell. Additionally, there were the batteries of daily calls shared with the infantry. The trompeteurs of la musique were an arrogant bunch, highly prized for their skill and courage. Each regiment had a trompette major, who led a handful of trompette brigadiers, with one assigned per company. Some regiments, especially the Cuirassiers, splurged for a few extras, usually to follow the colonel around. A skilled musician was hard to come by, and harder still to train up. When needed, a regiment might resort to the expedient of hiring a gagiste or a hired musician. The grande tenue for trompeteurs varied from regiment to regiment, with all sorts of extra adornments or unique pieces. Invariably, they wore a bright colour distinct from the mainline regiment, usually yellow or red for heavy cavalry, red for dragoons, and red, yellow, white, or blue for light cavalry. Cavalry regiments also had a long history with their regimental flags and colours. Royal Army cavalry units had bespoke flags in a range of colours, but generally a consistent style. As per the regulations of 1791, the National Convention enforced the drapeau d'ordonnance on all cavalry units, stipulating a common design based on the tricolour. Some cavalry demi-brigades obliged, others did not. Upon the advent of Empire, flag regulations changed again, and since the flag was the same, I'll just quote myself. Each squadron of the regiment would have its own eagle and flag based on a common pattern. Specified was that the flag had to be 81 cm squared, made of double-sided oiled silk, and wreathed in golden braid. The design changed from the tricolour to red and blue triangles set at each corner, centred around a central white lozenge. The regiment's establishment number ensconced in golden wreath sat in each triangle. One side of the flag, within the white lozenge, was emblazoned with the regiment's oath of fealty to Napoleon. The only real difference from the infantry were the designs for the Dragoon and Chasseur à cheval flags, who used swallow-tailed guidons. The eagle was identical too, 20 cm tall, made of a bronze-gold alloy, and perched atop a tall staff. Initially, 4 were issued to all regiments, but after 1808 only 1 per regiment, carried by the 1st Squadron. At the same time, the porte-aigle, the eagle bearer, at the rank of lieutenant, was reinforced by 2 bodyguards. Probably the only notably unique feature of the cavalry colours were the prominence of regimental mottos. None were permitted emblazoned on the official flags, as several recalled old royalist slogans, but the mottos made their way into all sorts of unofficial designs. We'll go through a few standouts. The 11e Cuirassiers motto read, Toujours au chemin de l'honneur, which means always by the path of honour. The 12e Hussars bore Noblesse oblige, Chamberon autant, meaning noblesse oblige, the chambereau just as much. A fair few were in Latin. For the premier Dragoons, Lilia non laborant neque nent, meaning lilies do not toil nor spin. For the 3e Chasseur, Vigile et audax, vigilance and audacity. And the 3e Hussars, Perit sed in armis, he perishes but under arms. Most mottos were unpretentious, standard fare martial refrains. Dragoons forward, until the death, upon the field of honour, those sorts of things. But then there were the funny ones, like the 11e Chasseur, which read, Voilà les bons, meaning in context, here are the good ones. And then there's my personal favourite, the 18e Chasseur, Toujours mon coude sur la selle, always with my arse in the saddle. For identification purposes, each company was further distinguished by a fanion, again the colour shared with the infantry. White for the 2nd companies, red for the 3rd, blue for the 4th, green for the 5th, yellow for the 6th, and where applicable, violet and sky blue for the 7th and 8th companies respectively. Squadrons also bore their own fanion, which seem not to have been made to a common template, save that the colours were different and they bore a symbol like crossed swords or a horseshoe. It seems that unlike in the infantry, the fanions were not well liked and mostly fell out of use after 1812. Instead, the cavalry fell back on an older form of identification, colour coordination in their mounts. When adhered to, colours were as follows: black for 1st and 5th companies, bay for the 2nd and 6th companies, chestnut for the 3rd and 7th companies, and greys and whites for the 4th and 8th companies. This sort of coordination was hard enough in peacetime, and all but impossible to keep consistently on campaign, so gradually the company colours denuded. The heavy cavalry hardly bothered. Black and dark brown horses were their mounts of choice, but none would begrudge a lighter animal. No matter the type of cavalry regiment, it was organised identically, save for the number of sabureurs and officers in its companies. We'll go from bottom to top, starting with enlisted ranks, which, by the way, are also consistent for all mounted soldiers in French service, so it applies just as well to the artillerie à cheval and gendarme à cheval. A single sabureur, equivalent in rank to a private, was called a cavalier, a horseman. A caporal, or corporal, was called a brigadier, and if in a supply or maintenance role, a brigadier fourrier. A sergeant was called a maréchal des logis, a senior or 1st sergeant a maréchal des logis en chef. As we've seen, there were 140 sabels, 116 sabels, and 86 sabels in full-strength light, medium, and heavy cavalry companies respectively. Of these complements, 4 were brigadiers, 1 a brigadier fourrier, and 2 were maréchal des logis, and 1 a maréchal des logis en chef. Numbers for the dragoon regiments were generally doubled, since they might need to split off a portion to fight on foot. Officer ranks followed the usual tiers. All officers started as a sous-lieutenant, later upranked to a lieutenant, 2 or 3 per company. Each company was led by a capitaine, a captain. Leading a squadron was a chef d'escadron. Given the number of squadrons in a regiment, there were at least 2, possibly 4 or more. A colonel commanded the regiment, backed up by a colonel en second in particularly large light and medium regiments. Their staff consisted of 1 or 2 majors and the commissaire or maître quartier, the quartermaster. All enlisted ranks had their rank insignia sewn into the lower, sometimes upper portion of their sleeve. Officers wore a golden epaulette over the left shoulder, though many would wear 2. All ranks of the cavalry had their ranks represented by stripes on their pantalons. The exception were the Hussars, who had a unique pattern derived from stitched crosswork worn on the lap, on the sleeves, and on the pelisse. These interesting patterns were more flash than purpose, but key to the symbology of the Hussars. Other light cavalry units followed suit, but against official prescriptions. Flashy uniforms, fine horses, and widespread acclaim aside, life in the cavalry was, ultimately, still life in the Grande Armée. Things were tough for man and mount, even when excluding the possibility of death or dismemberment. We'll get some basics out of the way first. On campaign, food was 1-for-1 with the infantry. Pain de munition or a flour ration, oats and sometimes hay for the horses, and whatever extra fruits, meats, alcohols and preserves could be scrounged up. Marching was the same, though of course the cavalry were mounted. All cavalry regiments would ride in their assigned divisions, leaving the middle of the road open for traffic in friendly territory and advancing over rough terrain as needed. Pace was set by the infantry in such instances, but the cavalry could generally deal with obstacles like stream and crags a bit better. The trick was not to needlessly hurt or tire out the horses. Often cavalry were detached on separate assignments, as we know, at which point they were not bound by the pace of the foot sloggers. At a canter, cavalry could cover massive distances in a few days. At their absolute fastest, on a forced march, the infantry might make 30 or 35 miles a day. On good terrain, the cavalry could triple that at least, and still have the energy to fight. Light cavalry, mounted on the fleetest and lightest horses, could go much further than their larger fellows, which came in useful for their long-range operations. Given the smaller-sized companies and the reliance on horses, stragglers and slowpokes were less common in cavalry advances, but there came inevitably the time to rest. Towns were preferred. Proper stables, apartments, warehouses and convents were crammed and hot, but a delight compared to the open-air alternative. A proper cavalry barracks was ideal, the bottom floor for the horses, the second with beds for the horsemen. Cavalry were almost invariably the ones going ahead to negotiate accommodations and bivouac arrangements. Cavalry officers could therefore bank on getting plum lodgings. If with the army or in hostile territory, the cavalry would bivouac in the open. Fires and kettles around the colonel's central tent, bedrolls under open sky. A corral had to be made for the horses, who in the lull would be fed and treated. Any lame or dead horses would be discarded, and replacements purchased, if possible, locally. Light cavalry could kind of come and go as they pleased. On long-range work, they had to make do in camping wherever was suitable, and that habit kept elsewhere. As the eyes and ears of the army, all cavalry were expected to be vigilant picket keepers. Before anything was done, passwords were picked and pickets fanned out. The nightly sojourn was a chance for some much-needed rest. A sole repaired, a uniform sewn up, or a quick shave. Perhaps some more personal time. A puff on the pipe, a letter home, or some extra sleep. We've had a good look at a fair few of the active French cavalry leaders of the Napoleonic Wars, all of whom were either holdovers from the Royal Army or patriotic volunteers from the early days of the Revolution. But what about officers commissioned subsequently during the wars? In the early years, most officers were trained at Fontainebleau, where they would be streamlined into the cavalry. Such was the case for Antoine de Brack, who graduated in 1803 and served with aplomb under Lassalle and Pajol in the Hussars. Life was strictly controlled, with recruits under close scrutiny and unwavering military discipline. Conditions could be miserable, but the education was first-rate. Students were schooled in the arts of war, as well as generalist subjects Napoleon specified. Cavalry instruction manuals were very modern. The oldest used consistently was from 1788, but most were written from 1801 to 1803, reflecting the years of experience accrued in the course of the Revolutionary Wars. A similar flourishing happened during the Napoleonic Wars, with manuals written on the tactics, maneuvers and regulations of all cavalry types, capstoned by the Ordonnance provisoire sur l'exercice et les manœuvres de la cavalerie of 1808, and then updated in 1815, the definitive manual on the subject of cavalry operations. Naturally, horse care and horsemanship were also taught at the école, and officers were expected to be a cut above the rank and file when it came to caring for and riding their animals. After Fontainebleau was sequestered in 1808, cavalry instruction was undertaken at Saint-Cyr and at a new institution, the École Spéciale de Cavalerie at Saint-Germain. While the lieutenants produced by Saint-Cyr were considered adequate, those graduating Saint-Germain failed to impress, lacking for knowledge and skill. Napoleon sought to get to the bottom of why one of his prestigious military colleges was so far off the mark. He was aghast to see brown bread the only food available, as the kitchen sold off or ate all the meat and veggies. The curriculum too was abbreviated, and Napoleon ordered history, literature, and geography be added immediately. Under the watchful eye of Guillaume Clark, Saint-Germain was rehabilitated. Fresh-faced lieutenants sent to the frontline cavalry postings had a hard time breaking through. But as the veterans died or retired, it was the youths, buoyed on tales of valour and glory, who populated officer ranks. Marbeau recalled the experience of reforging his damaged regiment after 1812 by pairing veterans to graduates. The result was, in his words, not perfect, but workable. Field commissions furnished most of the better officer replacements, especially after heavy battles. A senior NCO could be plucked from the ranks on merit, as encouraged by Napoleon. As in the infantry, a two-tier voting system was in place. Officers conferred on which candidates were suitable, and the colonel selected his preference. The cost for equipping a fresh commission was exorbitant on a common soldier's salary. It was hard enough on an officer's income. A gratuity was meant to accompany a promotion, the new officer given a couple hundred francs, maybe a few hundred more when the campaign commenced, and their choice of horse from among the remounts. But in practice, this gratuity was more like a loan, and never enough to fully cover the cost of the uniform and equipment. All cavalry officers were distinguished by their epaulettes. From lieutenant up to chef d'escadron, the right-hand epaulette was fringeless, but from major up, both epaulettes were fringed. The exception were hussar officers who wore no epaulettes, but instead galons on their sleeves above the cuff and on their breeches. The attachment officers felt for their epaulettes was profound, and they'd risk life and limb to get them. Marbeau notes the example of Boivin, a lieutenant of his regiment who he demoted for letting a condemned man escape. Upon facing the enemy at a bridge, the 11e Hussars fell into a Russian trap, the bridge sabotaged so that it gave way, killing several men and horses. Quote, "At the sight of this unfortunate accident, I became afraid that the enemy would have set a similar trap at the bridge towards which my column was now moving, so I halted there a moment to examine. It was a difficult business, for not only were the enemy's guns trained on that bridge, but it was open to fire from one of their battalions. Just as I was about to call for a volunteer to undertake the duty with a certainty of finding one, Sergeant Boivin dismounted and came up to me, saying that it was not fair that one of his comrades should be killed in reconnoitering the bridge, and begging me to let him do it in order to retrieve his fault. This noble determination pleased me, and I said, quote, 'Go, sir, and you will find your epaulette at the other end of the bridge.' Boivin advanced calmly in the thick of the fire, examined the flooring, went under the bridge, and came back to assure me that it was all sound. I reinstated him, and having remounted, he placed himself at the head of the leading squadron. Next month, when the Emperor reviewed the regiment and made several promotions, I got Boivin appointed to sous-lieutenant. Another important feature of officer life in the cavalry was the need for domestics. Poorer officers pooled their money for a shared servant, while wealthier, more senior officers might have entire teams. The need to mount the domestic was an added cost. Familiarity with horse care was not a prerequisite, but certainly desirable, as was the ability to speak a few languages. Loyal, polyglot, horse-happy domestics were a rare find not soon parted with. Marbot got very lucky with his domestic, François Voland, as we've seen. Speaking Spanish, German and passable French, he was an excellent trader and haggled with Marbot's many creditors and vendors. When Marbot was without a horse at Landshut, all his having been sold or killed, Warland found a grey in the stables of some allied Württemberger troops. They say don't look a gift horse in the mouth, in this case the thigh, as the animal bore the unmistakable crossed stag's horns, making it foreign property. Warland left Marbot's service in Spain, hoping to make a life for himself there. He was replaced by Lorenz Silkowski, a Pole formerly of an Austrian Ulan regiment. Lorenz's main asset was his fluent Russian, which got the pair into, and out of, many tight scrapes out east. And that does it for our survey of the cavalry arm of Le Grande Armée, from its origin to its organisation, uses, ranks and history. We've also covered all the branches of the cavalry force in detail too, examining their uniforms, equipment, lives and experiences. In so doing, we've met a fair few, though far from all, of the prominent cavalry officers of the era, getting a glimpse into their lives and exploits. Missing from all of this has been a look at tactics, but since this is pretty much every bit of 3 hours of content, I'll save that for a separate episode. But before that, we'll get a look at the big guns of Le Grande Armée with a top-to-bottom survey of the French artillery arm.